The wolf trap snapped around my leg just as I felt my bones starting to crack and reshape. And I knew my hunting buddies had finally figured out why animals kept disappearing during our camping trips. The silver-plated steel teeth bit deep into my calf, sending waves of burning agony through my body as my spine began to elongate and my jaw started pushing forward. Through the haze of pain and transformation, I could hear Blake's voice echoing through the trees. "Come on out, Ryan. We know what you are." But let me back up. Because 3 months ago, I was just another construction worker who lived for weekend hunting trips with my best friends. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and I've been swinging hammers and pouring concrete for Hartley Construction for the better part of 15 years. It's honest work, pays the bills, keeps me in decent shape, and gives me something to look forward to every month when Blake calls me up with that familiar excitement in his voice. "Pack your gear, brother," he'd say. "The boys are heading to Pine Ridge this weekend. Blake Torino and I have been best friends since high school. We met in shop class, both of us more interested in building things with our hands than sitting in some stuffy classroom talking about algebra. After graduation, while other kids went off to college, Blake and I stayed local, him taking over his dad's plumbing business, me learning construction from my uncle. Different trades, same mindset. Work hard during the week, play harder on weekends. Our hunting group formed naturally over the years. There's Blake and me as the core. Then Tommy Brennan joined us about 12 years ago when he moved to town for his job at the paper mill. Tommy's the quiet one, methodical, patient, the kind of guy who can sit in a tree stand for 8 hours without moving a muscle. Then there's Eddie Walsh, loud, obnoxious, but he knows these woods better than anyone. His family's been hunting this area for 3 generations. Finally, there's Carl Stevens, the newest addition from about 5 years ago. Carl's an accountant by day, but on weekends he transforms into this outdoors fanatic who treats every hunting trip like a military operation. We'd meet at Blake's house every 3rd Saturday of the month, load up his pickup truck with gear, coolers full of beer, and enough ammunition to take down half the forest. The drive to Pine Ridge took about 2 hours through winding back roads that got progressively narrower and more isolated. Blake knew a spot way back in the national forest, private land that his uncle supposedly had permission to hunt on. None of us ever questioned it. The hunting was too good, and we never saw another soul for miles. Pine Ridge isn't like those manicured hunting preserves you see on TV. This is raw, untamed wilderness. Thick stands of pine and oak that block out most of the sunlight, rocky outcroppings covered in moss and lichen, and streams that run so clear you can see the trout hiding under fallen logs. The silence out there is different than anything you experience in town. It's not just quiet. It's like the whole world is holding its breath. Our routine was always the same. Friday evening, we'd drive out and set up camp in this clearing Blake had found years ago, a roughly circular space, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines that formed natural windbreaks. Blake had built a permanent fire pit out of stones he'd hauled from the creek, and over the years we'd accumulated camping chairs, a decent camp table, and even a small storage shed where we kept extra gear. Saturday morning, we'd split up, each taking a different section of the woods to hunt solo. Saturday evening, we'd come back to camp, compare stories, and spend the night around the fire drinking beer and planning Sunday's hunt. Sunday, we'd usually hunt together as a group before packing up and heading home. It was a perfect system that worked for over a decade. Until 3 months ago, when everything went to hell. The first sign something was wrong happened in early June. I remember it clearly because Eddie had just gotten back from his honeymoon, and we were all giving him grief about being away from his new wife so soon. We'd had a successful Saturday. Tommy had bagged a nice 6-point buck, and Carl had gotten a turkey that would make excellent jerky. But when we returned to camp that evening, something felt off. The campsite looked normal at first glance. Our chairs were still arranged around the fire pit. The coolers were where we'd left them. The storage shed was still locked, but Blake noticed it first. "Guys," he said, his voice unusually tense. "Where's the deer?" Tommy had dressed his buck that afternoon and hung it from our usual tree, a thick oak branch about 8 feet off the ground, well out of reach of any scavengers. The rope was still there, still tied to the branch, but the deer was gone. Not fallen. Gone. The rope had been cut clean through. "Maybe a bear got it," Eddie suggested, but even as he said it, we all knew that was bullshit. A bear might tear down a hanging deer, but it wouldn't cut rope. And there would be blood everywhere. Torn meat, scattered bones. This was clean. Surgical. Blake examined the cut rope with his flashlight. "This was done with a knife," he said quietly. "A sharp one." We spent the next hour searching the campsite and surrounding area for any sign of who or what had taken Tommy's deer. No footprints. The ground was too hard and covered with pine needles. No blood trail. No drag marks. It was like the deer had simply vanished. "Probably just some locals who knew about our spot," Carl said, ever the logical one. "Maybe they've been watching us, waiting for us to leave something unattended." We tried to convince ourselves that's all it was, but the mood around the fire that night was different. Less laughing, more looking over our shoulders at the dark trees surrounding us. Eddie even suggested maybe we should find a new hunting spot, but Blake shot that down immediately. "Hell no," he said, cracking open another beer. "We've been coming here for 15 years. I'm not going to let some punk kids scare us away from our spot." The second incident happened 3 weeks later in late June. This time it was Eddie who'd made the kill, a decent-sized doe that he'd taken down about a quarter-mile from camp. He'd field dressed it on the spot and was dragging it back when something spooked him. He never could explain exactly what it was. He just said he got this overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. Eddie's not the type to get spooked easily. He grew up in these woods, knows every sound and smell. But something made him abandon that deer carcass and practically run back to camp. When we went back with him to retrieve it an hour later, we found something that made all of us seriously uncomfortable. The deer was still there, but it wasn't alone. Scattered around the carcass were the remains of at least 6 rabbits, 3 squirrels, and what looked like a fox. All dead, all arranged in a rough circle around Eddie's doe like some kind of offering, and every single one of them had been killed the same way. Single bite to the throat. So precise it was almost surgical. "What the hell kind of predator does this?" Tommy whispered, kneeling beside one of the rabbit carcasses. None of us had an answer. Bears don't arrange their kills. Mountain lions don't kill for sport like this. Wolves. Well, there haven't been wolves in this part of the country for over 100 years. Blake was the first to notice the tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft earth around the deer. Large, canine-looking prints, but wrong somehow. Too big for any domestic dog, with claw marks that seemed longer and sharper than any wolf tracks I'd ever seen in books. "We need to report this," Carl said, pulling out his phone. "This isn't normal animal behavior. Fish and Wildlife should know about it." But Blake grabbed Carl's wrist before he could dial. "And tell them what, exactly? That we found some dead animals in the woods? They'll ask us what we were doing out here. Start asking about hunting permits and property access." He shook his head. "Let's not invite that kind of attention." Looking back now, I realized that was the moment Blake started steering us away from involving any authorities. At the time, it seemed reasonable. None of us wanted to risk losing our hunting spot over some bureaucratic nonsense. But now I understand Blake had his own reasons for keeping our Pine Ridge trip secret. The third incident happened in mid-July, and this time I was the one who found it. I'd gotten up early that Sunday morning to do some solo scouting before the others woke up. The sunrise in those woods is something special, shafts of golden light filtering through the canopy, mist rising from the creek, the whole forest coming alive with bird songs. I was following a game trail about half a mile east of camp when I caught a scent that stopped me cold. It was wrong. Not the clean smell of decomposing leaves and rich earth I was used to. This was something fouler, metallic and sharp, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. The smell led me to a small clearing I'd never seen before, maybe 20 yards across, surrounded by thick undergrowth. At first glance, it looked like a slaughterhouse had exploded. There were animal parts everywhere. Not whole carcasses, but pieces. A deer leg here, a rabbit head there, something that might have been part of a wild turkey scattered across the clearing like confetti. But it was the tree in the center of the clearing that really got to me. It was a massive oak, probably 200 years old, with a trunk so thick it would take 3 men to wrap their arms around it, and hanging from its branches, God, I still see it in my nightmares, were dozens of animal skulls. Deer, rabbits, squirrels, birds, all picked completely clean and suspended from the branches with what looked like fishing line. In the center of the clearing, at the base of the tree, someone had arranged stones in a rough circle. Inside the circle, burned into the earth itself, was a symbol I didn't recognize. 3 interlocking triangles with lines extending from each point like rays of a dark sun. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just trying to process what I was looking at. This wasn't random animal predation. This was deliberate, ritualistic. Someone or something was using our hunting ground for purposes that had nothing to do with hunting. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to take pictures. I must have snapped 20 photos from different angles, making sure to capture every detail of that nightmare clearing. As I was backing away, getting ready to run back to camp and wake the others, I stepped on something soft. Looking down, I saw it was a piece of paper. Not old and weathered like you'd expect from something left in the woods, but fresh. White notebook paper, folded once, with writing in black ink. My name was on the outside in block letters. Ryan. I should have left it there. Should have run back to camp immediately and gotten the others. Instead, I unfolded that piece of paper and read the 5 words that changed everything. You smell different than them. I sprinted back to camp like something was chasing me, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, not caring about the noise I was making. By the time I burst into our campsite, the other guys were just starting to wake up. Blake was stoking the fire, getting ready to make coffee. Jesus, Ryan, he said, looking up at my wild-eyed appearance. You look like you've seen a ghost. I told them everything. The clearing, the skulls, the burned symbol, the note. I showed them the photos on my phone, watched their faces go pale as they scrolled through the images. Eddie actually threw up when he saw the skull tree. We're leaving, Carl announced, already starting to pack his gear. Right now, this is way beyond weird animal behavior. This is some serial killer shit. For once, I agreed with Carl completely, but Blake had other ideas. Hold on, he said calmly, still stirring the fire with a long stick. Let's think about this logically. Someone's obviously been using our spot for whatever this is. But that doesn't mean we have to abandon 15 years of tradition. We just need to be smarter about it. Smarter about it? Eddie stared at Blake like he'd lost his mind. Did you see those pictures? Someone left Ryan a fucking note. They know our names, Blake shrugged. So we bring more firepower next time. Set up some trail cameras. Maybe take shifts keeping watch. I'm not going to let some psychopath scare us away from the best hunting ground in the state. The argument that followed lasted over an hour. Carl and Eddie wanted to report everything to the police and never come back. Tommy was on the fence, clearly disturbed but unwilling to break up the group. And Blake had an answer for every concern, a reason why we shouldn't abandon Pine Ridge. In the end, he wore us down. Blake had always been the leader of our group, the one who made the plans and got things organized. He had a way of making his ideas sound reasonable, even when they weren't. By the time we loaded up the truck that morning, he'd convinced us to come back in 2 weeks with trail cameras and extra ammunition. I should have trusted my instincts. Should have walked away right then and never looked back. But Blake was my best friend. Had been since we were teenagers. If he thought we could handle whatever was happening at Pine Ridge, then maybe we could. The next trip was when everything started going wrong for me personally. It was the first weekend of August, oppressively hot even deep in the woods. We'd set up 6 trail cameras at strategic points around our usual hunting areas, hoping to catch whoever was responsible for the skull clearing. Blake had also convinced us to modify our usual routine. Instead of splitting up on Saturday morning, we'd hunt in pairs, never letting anyone go more than shouting distance from a partner. It seemed like a reasonable precaution at the time. Blake and I paired up, naturally. We'd hunted together countless times over the years, had an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements. Saturday morning we headed southwest from camp, toward a creek bed where Blake claimed he'd seen fresh deer sign. The heat was brutal, even under the forest canopy. By 10 a.m. my shirt was soaked with sweat, and the humidity was making it hard to breathe. Blake seemed unaffected, moving through the underbrush like he was born for it, never seeming to get tired or overheated. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Blake suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened carefully but couldn't make out anything beyond the normal forest sounds. Birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant babble of running water. "Hear what?" "Something big moving through the brush," he said, pointing toward a thick stand of pines about 50 yards ahead. "Sounds like it's wounded. Moving slow, dragging something." I still couldn't hear whatever Blake was hearing, but his senses had always been sharper than mine. If he said something was out there, I believed him. We approached the pine stand carefully, rifles ready, moving from tree to tree like we were stalking the biggest buck of our lives. As we got closer, I finally started to hear what Blake had detected, a rhythmic rustling sound, like something large pushing through dry leaves and branches, and underneath that, something that sounded almost like whimpering. Blake gestured for me to circle around to the left while he approached from the right. It was a standard hunting maneuver we'd used dozens of times before. I worked my way through the undergrowth, trying to stay quiet while keeping Blake in sight. That's when I saw it, and for a split second, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was big, bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, but moving on 4 legs through the pine trees. Its fur was dark, almost black, and matted with what looked like blood. But it was the way it moved that really unsettled me. Not like a wild animal, but almost deliberately, like it was trying to lead us somewhere. I was raising my rifle, trying to get a clear shot, when the thing suddenly stopped and turned to look directly at me. And that's when I realized it wasn't a dog or a wolf or any kind of natural animal. The face looking back at me was almost human, elongated and covered with fur, but with intelligent eyes that seemed to recognize me. Before I could react, before I could even shout a warning to Blake, the thing lunged straight at me, not attacking, but like it was trying to tackle me, bring me down without actually hurting me. I got my rifle up just in time to catch its weight against the barrel, but the impact sent me sprawling backward into a tangle of thorny bushes. Pain exploded through my body as dozens of thorns ripped through my clothes and into my skin. I could feel warm blood running down my arms and legs as I thrashed around, trying to get untangled. Above me, the creature was making this sound, not growling exactly, but something between a whine and a human voice trying to form words. "Ryan!" Blake's voice cut through my panic. "Where are you?" "Over here," I shouted back, finally managing to pull myself free from the thorns. "The thing, did you see it?" Blake came crashing through the underbrush, rifle ready, scanning the area. "See what?" I heard you yell, then a bunch of thrashing around. I looked around wildly, but the creature was gone. No sign it had ever been there except for some disturbed leaves and the blood from my torn clothes. "It was right here," I insisted. Some kind of, I don't know what it was, like a huge dog, but wrong somehow. It looked at me, Blake. I looked right at me like it knew me. Blake knelt down and examined the ground where I'd fallen. "I don't see any tracks," he said after a moment. "Must have been on hard-packed earth." He stood up and looked at me with concern. "You're pretty torn up. Some of those cuts look deep." For the first time, I really looked at my injuries. My arms and legs were covered with scratches from the thorns, most of them superficial, but a few that were bleeding pretty freely. But there was one wound on my left forearm that didn't look like it came from thorns at all. 2 parallel cuts, maybe 3 inches long, that looked almost like bite marks. "This one's weird," I said, showing Blake my forearm. "Looks like something bit me." Blake examined the wound carefully, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he probed around the edges. "Could be you caught yourself on a broken branch when you fell," he said. "But we should clean this up properly when we get back to camp. Don't want it getting infected." The rest of that day passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The wounds on my arms and legs healed normally over the next few days, but the bite mark on my forearm seemed to get worse instead of better. It didn't look infected exactly, just angry and red, like my body was rejecting the healing process. More disturbing were the dreams. Starting the night after our encounter in the pine stand, I began having incredibly vivid nightmares. I'd dream I was running through dark woods, chasing something I could never quite see. The weird part was how real it felt. I could smell the pine needles and damp earth, feel branches whipping against my face, hear my heart pounding in my chest. I'd wake up exhausted, like I'd actually been running all night. My sheets would be soaked with sweat, and sometimes I'd find dirt under my fingernails even though I'd showered before going to bed. But the really strange part was how good I felt during the day. The construction work that had been wearing me down for years suddenly felt effortless. I was lifting heavier loads, working longer hours, and barely getting tired. My appetite increased dramatically. I found myself craving rare steaks and raw hamburger in a way that should have been disgusting but somehow wasn't. Blake noticed the changes when he came by my apartment about 2 weeks after our Pine Ridge trip. I was cooking dinner, or trying to. When he knocked on my door, I bought a couple of thick ribeye steaks, planning to grill them medium rare like always. But when I cut into the first one to check the doneness, the sight of all that red meat just made my mouth water uncontrollably. "Jesus, Ryan," Blake said, looking at my plate when I answered the door. "That steak is practically still mooing." I looked down and realized he was right. The meat was barely seared on the outside, completely raw in the middle, and it looked absolutely delicious to me. I guess I didn't cook it long enough," I said, suddenly embarrassed. Blake invited himself in, which wasn't unusual. We'd been dropping by each other's places unannounced for years, but something felt different this time. He seemed to be studying me, watching my reactions to things more carefully than usual. "You feeling okay lately?" he asked, settling into my living room couch. "You look different somehow." "Different how? I don't know. Healthier maybe? Like you've been working out or something. And your eyes." He paused, tilting his head like he was trying to figure something out. "Your eyes look brighter, more alert." I made some excuse about getting better sleep and eating more protein, but Blake's observation stuck with me. That night I spent a long time looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, trying to see what he'd seen. My reflection did look different. My face seemed leaner, more angular. My canine teeth looked sharper somehow, more pronounced. And my eyes, they did look brighter, almost like they were reflecting light. The changes accelerated over the following weeks. My senses became incredibly acute. I could hear conversations from across construction sites, smell what people had eaten for lunch from 20 feet away. My night vision improved to the point where I barely needed artificial light to see clearly in darkness, but it was the blackouts that really scared me. They started about a month after the Pine Ridge incident. Periods of time where I'd simply lose several hours with no memory of what I'd done. I'd go to bed on Friday night and wake up Saturday morning with dirt under my fingernails and scratches on my arms that I couldn't explain. One particularly bad episode happened on a night when the moon was full and incredibly bright. I went to bed around 10 p.m., feeling restless and agitated for no reason I could identify. The next thing I remember was waking up naked in my backyard at 3 in the morning, covered in mud and what looked like blood that wasn't mine. My neighbor's cat was missing the next day. Mrs. Henderson asked me if I'd seen Tiger, a fat orange tabby that usually spent his nights prowling the neighborhood. I told her I hadn't, and technically that was true, because I couldn't remember seeing anything. But deep down, in a part of my mind I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew what had happened to that cat. The worst part was how good I felt the morning after these blackout episodes. Instead of being tired and disoriented, I'd wake up energized and alert, like I'd gotten the best night's sleep of my life. My body felt strong and powerful, like I could take on any challenge. Blake started checking up on me more frequently during this period. He dropped by unexpectedly, always with some excuse. Wanted to borrow a tool, thought we should grab a beer, heard about a job opportunity I might be interested in. But I got the feeling he was really there to observe me, to monitor how I was changing. "You sure you're feeling all right?" he asked one evening in late August. We were sitting on my back porch, drinking beers and watching the sunset. "You seem, I don't know, more intense lately, like you're wound up about something." I wanted to tell him everything. The blackouts, the strange cravings, the way my body felt like it was changing into something else. Blake was my best friend. If anyone would understand, it would be him. But something held me back. Some instinct warned me that sharing these details would be dangerous. "Just work stress," I lied. "Got a big project coming up, lots of overtime." Blake nodded, but I could see he wasn't buying it. He stayed for another hour, making small talk and watching me carefully. As he was getting ready to leave, he paused at my back door. "Ryan," he said, his voice unusually serious. "If something was wrong, something you couldn't handle on your own, you'd come to me, right? You'd let me help?" "Of course," I said automatically. "We're brothers, Blake. Always have been." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good, because the boys and we're planning another trip to Pine Ridge next weekend. And I think you should come. I think it might help with whatever's been bothering you." That should have been my cue to make an excuse, to stay home and figure out what was happening to me. But the mention of Pine Ridge triggered something deep in my brain. A pull, almost like hunger, toward those dark woods. Despite everything rational in my mind telling me to stay away, I heard myself agreeing to the trip. "Great," Blake said, and this time his smile seemed genuine. "I think this trip is going to solve a lot of problems." The night before we left for Pine Ridge, I had the most vivid dream yet. I was running through the forest, but not as myself, as something else. Something with 4 legs and incredible speed, moving through the underbrush like I'd been born for it. The smells were overwhelming. Every plant, every animal, every trace of human presence lit up in my consciousness like neon signs. I was hunting something, following a scent trail that made my mouth water with anticipation. The trail led me to a clearing where a figure stood waiting. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, like it was wearing a human body like an ill-fitting costume. "Finally," the figure said in a voice I almost recognized. "I was beginning to think you'd never find me." I tried to respond, but the sounds that came out weren't words. They were growls and snarls, the vocalizations of an animal that had never learned human speech. "Don't fight it," the figure continued. "This is what you were meant to be, what I made you to be." I woke up with that voice echoing in my head, and for just a moment before full consciousness returned, I could have sworn I was still in that clearing, could still smell pine trees and damp earth instead of my apartment's stale air. The drive to Pine Ridge that Friday was different than usual. Eddie seemed nervous, constantly checking the rearview mirror like we were being followed. Carl had barely said 2 words since we'd picked him up. Tommy kept cleaning his rifle, taking it apart and reassembling it obsessively. Only Blake seemed relaxed, whistling along to the radio, making jokes that nobody laughed at, acting like this was just another normal hunting trip. But I caught him watching me in the passenger mirror several times, and there was something calculating in his expression that I'd never seen before. "So," he said as we turned onto the final dirt road leading to our campsite, "anybody check those trail cameras we set up last month?" "I did," Carl said quietly. "Yesterday morning, before we left," and Carl was silent for a long moment. "They were all destroyed. Every single one. Looked like something had taken a baseball bat to them. Or maybe claws." The campsite looked exactly the same as always. Fire pit, storage shed, the circle of trees that formed our natural boundaries. But something felt different as soon as I stepped out of Blake's truck. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no small animals rustling through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Tommy asked, voicing what we were all thinking. Blake was already unloading gear from the truck bed. "Probably just means there's a storm coming. Animals always go quiet before bad weather." But I could smell something on the air. Something familiar but wrong. It was the same scent that had led me to that nightmare clearing 3 months ago, but stronger now, more personal. Like whatever had left that scent was specifically waiting for me. We set up camp with unusual efficiency, nobody talking more than necessary. As the sun began to set, Blake built our traditional campfire while the rest of us arranged our sleeping bags and checked our weapons. The plan was the same as always. Split up in the morning for individual hunts, meet back at camp in the evening. But as we sat around the fire that night, passing around a bottle of whiskey, I could tell everyone's mind was on the same thing. Whatever had been using our hunting ground for its own purposes was still out there. And now we were in its territory. 5 men with guns facing an unknown threat in the middle of nowhere. "So," Eddie said after we'd all had a few drinks, "what's the plan if we actually encounter this thing? Whatever's been leaving those displays." Blake poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark sky. "Same as any dangerous animal," he said calmly. "Shoot first. Ask questions later." "What if it's not an animal?" Carl asked. "What if it's a person? Someone who's just seriously disturbed?" "Oh, then we defend ourselves appropriately," Blake replied. "Look, guys, I know this situation is weird, but we're not helpless here. We're armed, we're experienced hunters, and we know these woods better than whoever's been messing with us." Tommy took a long pull from the whiskey bottle before passing it to me. "Easy for you to say, Blake. You weren't the one who found that skull tree. You weren't the one who got that creepy note." All eyes turned to me, and I felt suddenly exposed in the firelight. "It's probably nothing," I said, taking my own swig of whiskey. "Just someone trying to scare us away." But even as I said it, I could feel something watching us from the darkness beyond our fire. Something patient and hungry, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "Well," Blake said, standing up and stretching, "whatever happens, we'll face it together, like we always have." He was looking directly at me when he said it, and for just a moment, his eyes seemed to reflect the firelight like an animal's. Then, he blinked, and they were normal again. "I'm turning in," he announced. "Big day tomorrow." One by one, the others followed suit until I was left alone by the dying fire. The woods around our campsite were completely silent now. Not even the sound of insects or night birds, just the crackling of burning wood and my own heartbeat, which seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. That's when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It started as a low humming, almost like someone singing a wordless tune. But as it continued, the humming began to change, becoming deeper, more guttural, until it sounded less like a human voice and more like the vocalization of some large predator. The sound was coming from multiple directions, not just one source, but several, surrounding our campsite. As I sat there frozen by the fire, I realized with growing horror that whatever was out there wasn't just watching us. It was coordinating, multiple entities working together with obvious intelligence and purpose. I should have woken the others immediately. Should have grabbed my rifle and started shooting into the darkness. Instead, I found myself standing up and walking toward the edge of our campsite, drawn by something I couldn't resist or understand. The humming stopped as soon as I left the circle of firelight. The forest was completely silent again, but I could feel presences all around me, watching, evaluating, waiting. My enhanced senses were picking up scents and sounds that should have been impossible to detect. The smell of wet fur and fresh blood, the sound of breathing that was too deep and slow to be human. "Ryan." The voice came from directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck. I spun around, expecting to see Blake or one of the other guys checking on me. Instead, I found myself face to face with the creature from my dreams. It stood upright like a man, but everything else about it was wrong. Its body was covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Its face was elongated into a muzzle filled with teeth that were definitely not human. And its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was ancient and hungry, and completely alien. "You've been fighting it," the creature said in a voice that sounded like gravel being ground together. "The change I gave you, but tonight, under the full moon, you won't be able to resist anymore." I tried to run, tried to scream for help, but my body wouldn't obey my commands. I could only stand there and listen, as the thing that had been stalking me for months finally revealed its purpose. "I've been waiting so long for someone like you," it continued. "Someone strong enough to survive the transformation, intelligent enough to be useful. Your friends think they're hunting me, but I've been hunting them, and you're going to help me." "I won't," I managed to whisper. "Whatever you are, whatever you want, I won't help you hurt my friends." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You won't have a choice. The change is already too advanced to resist. When the moon reaches its peak tonight, you'll become what I made you, and then we'll see how loyal you really are to those friends of yours." That's when the first wave of pain hit me. A sensation like my bones were being broken and reset from the inside out. I fell to my knees, gasping and retching as my body began to betray me. Through the haze of agony, I could hear the creature moving away, its voice drifting back through the darkness. "Don't fight it, Ryan. Fighting only makes it hurt worse." The transformation was nothing like the movies make it seem. There was no dramatic music, no special effects, just wave after wave of indescribable pain as my human body was reshaped into something else. My spine elongated, forcing me to arch my back in ways that should have been impossible. My jaw pushed forward, my teeth lengthening and sharpening until I could taste blood in my mouth. But the worst part was how good it felt when the pain finally stopped. The strength that flooded through my new body was intoxicating, every sense amplified beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I could hear individual heartbeats from inside our tents, smell the fierce sweat of my sleeping friends, see clearly in darkness that would have been impenetrable to human eyes. For a moment, I almost understood why the creature had chosen this existence. The power was seductive. The feeling that you were apex predator in a world of helpless prey. Then I heard Blake's voice calling my name from the campsite, and my human consciousness reasserted itself with brutal clarity. Whatever I had become, whatever monstrous form I now wore, I was still Ryan Mitchell underneath, and I would not let this thing use me to hurt the people I cared about most. I tried to stand on my hind legs like I had as a human, but my new anatomy wouldn't cooperate. 4 legs felt natural now, more natural than walking upright ever had. The realization terrified me almost as much as the transformation itself, how much of my humanity was already lost. Ryan. Blake's voice was closer now, maybe 50 yards away. Where are you, man? Your sleeping bag's empty. I wanted to call back to him, to warn him about the creature that was still somewhere in these woods. But when I opened my mouth, the only sound that came out was a low whine that barely sounded human. Panic flooded through me as I realized I might not be able to change back. What if this form was permanent? What if I was trapped forever as some kind of monster, unable to communicate with the people I loved, unable to explain what had happened to me? That's when I caught the scent. Blake's scent, but wrong somehow, mixed with something else, something wild and predatory that made every instinct in my new body scream danger. I followed the smell through the dark woods, moving more quietly than should have been possible for something my size. My padded feet made no sound on the pine needle floor, and my enhanced hearing picked up every sound Blake made as he searched for me. His breathing, his heartbeat, even the rustle of his clothes as he moved. But there was something else moving through the woods too. Something that smelled like Blake, but wasn't Blake. The realization hit me like a physical blow as I remembered the creature's words from earlier. It had been hunting my friends, and I was supposed to help. I crested a small ridge and looked down into a narrow valley where Blake stood in a small clearing, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. He was calling my name softly, trying not to wake the others back at camp. But he wasn't alone. Circling the clearing at the edge of the tree line was another creature, one that looked almost exactly like the thing that had transformed me. Dark fur, elongated muzzle, eyes that glowed with unnatural light. But this one was bigger, older, and when it moved, I caught a scent that made my blood run cold. I knew that scent. I'd been smelling it for 15 years, every time Blake and I went hunting together. But now, filtered through my transformed senses, I could detect the underlying wildness that had always been there, hidden beneath his human facade. Blake wasn't my best friend. Blake wasn't even human. He was the original creature, the thing that had been using our hunting trips to Pine Ridge for its own purposes all along. The skull tree, the arranged animal carcasses, the missing deer. It had all been Blake, practicing and perfecting his predatory instincts while maintaining his human disguise. And 3 months ago, when that wild animal had attacked me in the pine stand, that hadn't been some random encounter. Blake had deliberately infected me, turning me into another monster like himself. The creature circling the clearing stopped directly across from where Blake stood and slowly began to change. I watched in horrified fascination as its body reshaped itself, fur retracting, muzzle shortening, limbs adjusting until it stood upright in perfect human form. It was Blake. Exactly Blake, down to the clothes he'd been wearing when I last saw him at our campfire. The thing looked at its hands. flexed its fingers, then smiled with Blake's face. "Perfect," it said in Blake's voice. "The transformation is getting smoother each time." But the real Blake was still standing in the clearing, rifle raised, scanning the tree line for threats. Two identical Blakes, one human and one monster wearing human form. "Ryan," the human Blake called out again. "Come on, man, this isn't funny. Eddie and the guys are starting to wake up." The creature wearing Blake's appearance stepped out of the trees, moving with perfect human man mannerisms. "Hey there, buddy," it said conversationally. "Looking for someone?" Human Blake spun around, and I saw his face go white with terror as he found himself staring at his own doppelganger. "What? What the hell are you?" "I'm you," the creature replied, still smiling with Blake's face. "Or rather, I'm what you're going to become." See, Ryan wasn't the only one I infected 3 months ago. That little scratch you got helping him clean his wounds? That was all I needed. Blake raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim. "You're lying. I would know if I was changing into something. Would you?" The creature tilted its head with mock curiosity. "Haven't you been having strange dreams lately? Waking up tired? Like you'd been running all night? Finding yourself craving raw meat? Noticing how much sharper your senses have become?" I could see the recognition dawning in Blake's eyes. The same symptoms I'd been experiencing. The same changes I'd tried to convince myself were normal. "The difference between you and Ryan," the creature continued, "is that Ryan fought the transformation, tried to resist what he was becoming. You embraced it. Every blackout episode, every night you don't remember, you've been out here with me, learning, hunting, becoming the predator you were meant to be." "No," Blake whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I would remember. Your human mind blocks out the memories to protect itself. But deep down, you know the truth. You know why you've been so insistent about coming back to Pine Ridge, even when the others wanted to stay away. You know why you've been steering the group away from involving authorities. This is your territory now, Blake. Our territory." The rifle fell from Blake's hands as the weight of revelation hit him. I could smell his despair from 50 yards away, a sour scent that made my own transformed heart break with sympathy. "Ryan was supposed to complete his transformation tonight and join us willingly," the creature said. "But since he's being stubborn about accepting his new nature, I thought maybe a demonstration would help convince him. Show him what happens to humans who can't adapt to our world." That's when I realized what was about to happen. The creature wasn't here to recruit Blake. It was here to eliminate him, to remove the human consciousness that was preventing Blake from fully becoming a monster. And somewhere in these woods, Eddie, Tommy, and Carl were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their hunting trip had become a trap designed to lure them into the territory of apex predators. I had to make a choice. I could try to flee, use my new speed and strength to escape Pine Ridge and never look back, leave Blake to his fate and hope the creature would be satisfied with one victim. Or I could fight, use the monster's own weapon against it, the transformed body it had given me, turn toward protecting the humans it wanted to destroy. The decision was easier than it should have been. Blake might not be entirely human anymore, but he was still my best friend. The man who taught me how to tie fishing knots when we were 12, who'd been best man at my sister's wedding, who'd held me while I cried when my father died of cancer 5 years ago. Whatever else Blake had become, he was still worth saving. I bounded down the ridge toward the clearing, no longer caring about stealth. My new body was built for speed and power, and I used every advantage it gave me. The creature heard me coming and spun around just as I launched myself through the air. We collided with enough force to splinter trees. Two monsters fighting with superhuman strength and ferocity. Its claws raked across my ribs, drawing blood that steamed in the cool night air. but I got my teeth into its throat, tasting something that was like blood but wrong somehow, metallic and bitter. The thing threw me off with incredible strength, sending me crashing into a fallen log that exploded into splinters. As I struggled to my feet, it was already changing, abandoning Blake's human form and revealing its true nature. It was bigger than me, older, more experienced at being what we were. Its fur was graying with age, and scars across its muzzle spoke of countless previous battles. When it snarled, I could see teeth that had been sharpened to razor points. "You stupid whelp," it growled in a voice like breaking stone. "I offered you power beyond imagination, and you choose to protect these weak humans? They would kill you without hesitation if they knew what you really are." It lunged at me again, faster than I could react. Its weight drove me to the ground, and I felt claws digging deep into my shoulders. The pain was incredible, like being stabbed with red-hot knives. But worse than the physical agony was the realization that it was right. I was a monster now. Even if I somehow survived this fight, even if I managed to save Blake and the others, what kind of life could I have? How long before my human friends discovered what I'd become? How long before they realized I was the real threat they should be afraid of? The creature sensed my moment of doubt and pressed its advantage, jaws snapping toward my throat. But as its teeth closed on empty air, I heard something that gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. Blake was calling my name, not the creature wearing Blake's form, the real Blake, still human, still my friend despite everything that had happened. "Ryan, I don't know what you are, but I know you're still you. Fight this thing." I grabbed the creature's muzzle with both hands and twisted hard to the right, feeling bones snap. It howled in pain and rage, releasing its grip on my shoulders. Before it could recover, I drove my knee up into its ribs with enough force to lift its massive body off the ground. The fight became a blur of pain and violence. We rolled across the forest floor, each seeking the killing bite that would end the battle. Blood. Mine. Its. Impossible to tell which was which. Soaked the ground beneath us. Tree branches cracked and fell as our struggle sent us crashing through the undergrowth. But gradually, I began to realize I was winning. The creature was old and powerful, but it had grown complacent during its years of easy hunting. It had forgotten what it was like to face genuine resistance. My human consciousness, the very thing it saw as weakness, was actually my greatest advantage. I could think strategically, anticipate its moves, use tactics instead of relying purely on animal instinct. I managed to get behind it and wrapped my arms around its throat, applying pressure to the carotid arteries. In human form, this would be a blood choke that could render someone unconscious in seconds. But I wasn't sure how werewolf anatomy worked, whether the same techniques would be effective. The creature thrashed wildly, trying to dislodge me, but I held on with desperate strength. Its struggles grew weaker, its movements less coordinated. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, it went limp in my arms. I held the choke for another 30 seconds, making sure it wasn't feigning unconsciousness. When I was finally convinced it was truly out, I released my grip and stumbled backward. The creature lay motionless in the torn-up clearing, chest barely rising and falling. For a moment, I considered finishing it, making sure it could never threaten anyone again. But looking at its unconscious form, all I could see was a broken, ancient thing that had been alone for too long. Instead, I turned to Blake, who was staring at me with a mixture of terror and amazement. "Ryan?" he said hesitantly. Is that really you in there?" I tried to speak, to reassure him that I was still his friend despite my monstrous appearance. But my throat was torn from the fight, and all that came out was a rasping whine. Blake took a step closer, and I caught his scent again. Still human, still my best friend, but with that underlying wildness that meant his own transformation was inevitable. The creature hadn't been lying about infecting him. Blake was maybe a month away from becoming what I was now. "It's okay," Blake said softly, apparently reading something in my expression. "I think I understand what happened. That thing, it did something to both of us, didn't it? Changed us into this." I nodded, relief flooding through me as I realized Blake wasn't afraid of me, horrified by the situation. Yes, but not afraid of me personally. He still saw his friend underneath the monster's exterior. "We need to get back to camp," Blake continued. "Eddie and the others." So they heard the fighting. They're probably awake by now, maybe even coming to investigate. And when they see you like this, he didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew exactly what would happen if Eddie, Tommy, and Carl found me in werewolf form. They'd shoot first and ask questions later. Exactly what any rational person would do when confronted with a monster in the woods. But as I tried to concentrate on changing back to human form, nothing happened. I was stuck, trapped in this body with no idea how to return to my original shape. Panic started to set in as I realized the full scope of my situation. I was a monster now, possibly permanently. My best friend was infected and would soon become the same kind of creature. And somewhere back at our campsite, 3 good men were probably loading their rifles and preparing to hunt down whatever had been making all the noise in the woods. That's when I heard them. Voices calling our names. Flashlight beams dancing between the trees as Eddie, Tommy, and Carl searched for their missing friends. "Blake! Ryan! Where are you guys?" Blake looked at me with desperate eyes. "I'll try to lead them away," he whispered. "Give you time to figure out how to change back, or at least find somewhere to hide until morning." But even as he said it, we both knew it was hopeless. My scent was all over this clearing. Blood and musk, and the unmistakable smell of predator. Eddie was an experienced tracker. He'd follow the trail directly to where I stood. The voices were getting closer. Maybe 5 minutes before they reached our position. "Ryan," Blake said urgently, "I need you to listen carefully. That thing said I've been transforming during my blackout episodes, that I've been out here hunting with it. If that's true, then I'm just as much a monster as you are. Maybe more, because I chose to embrace it while you fought against it." I shook my massive head, trying to communicate that he was wrong. That being infected wasn't his fault any more than it was mine. "No, listen," he insisted. "If they're going to find a monster in these woods, it should be me, not you. You never asked for this, never chose it. But I did. Every time I suggested coming back to Pine Ridge despite the warning signs. Every time I talked the group out of involving authorities. I was protecting that creature, helping it." The sound of approaching footsteps was clearly audible now. Eddie's voice called out, "I think I see a light up ahead." "This way, guys." Blake pulled a silver pendant from around his neck. Something I'd never noticed him wearing before. It was roughly circular, with strange symbols carved into its surface that looked similar to the mark I'd found burned into the ground at the Skull Tree clearing. "The creature gave me this," Blake explained quickly. "Said it would help control the transformations. Let me change at will instead of being forced to transform during the full moon. I think if you touch it, it might trigger your change back to human form." I stared at the pendant, every instinct screaming that it was dangerous. The silver itself would burn my transformed flesh. And those symbols, they radiated wrongness in a way that made my supernatural senses recoil. "Please, Ryan," Blake begged. "Let me do this one thing right. Let me save my best friend." The flashlight beams were visible through the trees now. Maybe 2 minutes until Eddie and the others reached our clearing and saw me in all my monstrous glory. I reached out with one clawed hand and touched the silver pendant. Pain exploded through my body. Not the bone-deep ache of transformation, but something worse. It felt like liquid fire was flowing through my veins, burning away everything that wasn't purely human. The werewolf's strength, the enhanced senses, the predatory instincts. All of it was being torn out of me and destroyed. But along with the supernatural abilities, something else was being burned away. My memories of the past 3 months were dissolving like smoke. The blackout episodes, the strange cravings, even most details of tonight's events. The pendant wasn't just forcing me back into human form, it was erasing the supernatural experiences from my mind. As the transformation completed and I collapsed naked and shivering in the torn-up clearing, I retained only fragments of what had happened. I remembered being attacked by some kind of animal, remembered fighting something in the woods, but the details were already fading like a half-remembered dream. Blake was kneeling beside me, wrapping his jacket around my shoulders. "Easy, buddy," he said gently. "You're okay now. Just some kind of wild animal attack, but you fought it off. You're gonna be fine." I looked around the clearing, trying to piece together what had happened. There were signs of a tremendous struggle. Broken trees, blood on the ground, deep gouges in the earth, but no sign of whatever I'd been fighting. "Where?" I croaked through my damaged throat. "Where did it go?" Blake glanced toward the trees where the unconscious creature still lay hidden in the shadows. "It ran off when it realized you weren't easy prey," he said. "Probably miles away by now." Eddie, Tommy, and Carl burst into the clearing just then, rifles ready and faces grim with determination. They took in the scene, the destruction, my naked and battered condition, Blake kneeling protectively beside me. "Jesus Christ," Eddie breathed. "What happened here?" "Bear attack," Blake said without hesitation. "Big one, probably 7 feet tall. Ryan fought it off bare-handed, but it tore him up pretty bad before it ran off. Tommy was already pulling a first aid kit from his backpack. We need to get him to a hospital. Some of these cuts look deep." As my friends worked to stabilize my injuries and get me ready for transport, Blake caught my eye one last time. He was smiling, but there was something infinitely sad in his expression, like a man who knew he was seeing his best friend for the last time. "Take care of yourself, Ryan," he said quietly. "And maybe find some new hobbies. Indoor hobbies." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the adrenaline was wearing off and shock was setting in. The last thing I remember from that night was being carried out of the woods on an improvised stretcher, looking up at stars that seemed strangely dim after something I couldn't quite recall. The doctors at the regional hospital said I was incredibly lucky. Bear attacks were usually fatal, but somehow I'd escaped with nothing worse than deep lacerations and severe bruising. I spent 3 days in the hospital while they cleaned and stitched my wounds, then another week at home recovering. Blake visited me every day during my recovery, bringing books and magazines and keeping me company while I healed. But something was different about him, a distance that hadn't been there before. Like he was already saying goodbye. On my last day of recovery, he brought me a newspaper clipping. "Thought you might be interested in this," he said, handing me the article. The headline read, "Local man killed in hiking accident." Below that was a photo of Blake, my Blake, smiling at the camera. According to the article, Blake Torino had fallen from a cliff while hiking alone in the Pine Ridge area. His body had been found by search and rescue teams after he failed to return from a solo camping trip. I stared at the newspaper in confusion. "This doesn't make sense," I said to the Blake sitting beside my hospital bed. "You're right here. You're not dead." Blake smiled that same sad smile I remembered from the clearing. "I know it's confusing, buddy. Head injuries can mess with your memory sometimes. But I'm not Blake. I'm his cousin, Marcus. Marcus Torino? We met a few times over the years, but I don't blame you for mixing us up. Blake always said we looked a lot alike." As he spoke, I found myself nodding along, the memories shifting and changing to accommodate this new information. Of course, this was Marcus. Blake's cousin. Blake was dead, killed in a hiking accident while I was recovering from my own encounter with that bear. The funeral's tomorrow, Marcus continued. I know you're not supposed to be discharged until next week, but I talked to the doctors. They're willing to make an exception if you want to say goodbye. I attended Blake Torino's funeral on crutches, my body still healing from the bear attack that had nearly killed me. The casket was closed. Marcus explained that the fall had been too severe for an open viewing. I said goodbye to my best friend of 15 years, never knowing that the man standing beside me at the graveside was wearing Blake's face like a mask. The hunting trips to Pine Ridge ended after that. Without Blake to organize them, the group just fell apart naturally. Eddie moved to another state for work. Tommy got married and lost interest in hunting. Carl developed arthritis that made outdoor activities too painful. I found new hobbies, just like Blake. Marcus, whoever he really was, had suggested. Indoor hobbies that didn't involve spending time in remote wilderness areas. I took up reading, started learning guitar, began volunteering at a local animal shelter. The animal shelter work was particularly rewarding. There was something about being around dogs and cats that felt familiar somehow, like I understood their body language and instincts in a way that other volunteers didn't. The shelter director said I had a natural gift for working with even the most aggressive and traumatized animals. Sometimes, late at night when the moon was full and bright, I'd feel restless and agitated for no reason I could identify. I'd find myself standing at my window, staring out at the woods behind my apartment complex, feeling like I was supposed to be out there running through the trees. But those feelings always passed with the sunrise, and I'd go back to my normal life, construction work during the week, quiet evenings at home, visits to the animal shelter on weekends, a peaceful, ordinary existence that felt like exactly what I was meant to be living. I never saw Marcus Torino again after Blake's funeral. Sometimes I wondered what happened to him, whether he'd moved away, found his own life somewhere else. But mostly I tried not to think about that terrible weekend at Pine Ridge. The doctor said it was normal for trauma victims to have trouble remembering details of their attacks. The only memento I kept from that time was a small silver pendant that I'd apparently been clutching when Eddie and the others found me in the woods. It was roughly circular, with strange symbols carved into its surface that hurt to look at directly. None of my friends could remember seeing it before, and I had no memory of where it came from, but something about the pendant felt important, like it was protecting me from something I couldn't remember, so I wore it on a chain around my neck, hidden beneath my shirts, and tried not to think too hard about why touching it sometimes made my skin burn. Years passed. I got promoted to foreman at the construction company, started dating a nurse named Sarah who shared my love of animals, even bought a small house with a yard where I could have my own vegetable garden. The life of a perfectly ordinary man who'd survived a bear attack and learned to appreciate simple pleasures. The nightmares came occasionally. Dreams of running through dark forests, hunting something I could never quite see. But everyone has bad dreams sometimes. The doctor said it was probably just my mind processing the trauma of that night at Pine Ridge. I never questioned why I could never remember exactly what had happened during those missing hours in the woods. Never wondered why my friend's story about the bear attack didn't quite make sense when I really thought about it. Never asked myself why I instinctively knew how to calm frightened animals with just a touch and a quiet word. Some truths are too dangerous to remember. Some monsters are too terrible to face, even when they're wearing your own skin. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is clear, I catch myself wondering what Blake would think of the life I've built, whether he'd be proud of how normal I've become, how successfully I've buried the darkness that once threatened to consume everything I cared about. And then I touch the silver pendant beneath my shirt, feel the familiar burn against my skin, and remember that some secrets are meant to stay buried. After all, some monsters choose to be monsters, while others choose to forget they ever were monsters at all. What would you choose? The power to remember everything, even the parts that would destroy your peace, or the mercy of forgetting, even if it means living a lie. Think about that the next time you're lying in bed, listening to sounds outside your window that don't quite belong to any animal you know. Because maybe, just maybe, one of your oldest friends isn't quite as human as you remember them being. Sweet dreams. My son's Little League teammates were still screaming as I felt my bones crack and reshape on the pitcher's mound, and I realized the full moon had risen earlier than I'd calculated. Jake was standing frozen at first base, his 8-year-old face twisted in confusion as he watched his dad's jaw begin to elongate. 23 other kids, their parents, and the opposing team's coaches were about to witness something that would either get me locked up in a psychiatric ward or hunted down by people who knew exactly what I was becoming. But let me back up to this morning, when I was just Tom Brennan, divorced accountant and weekend warrior dad, getting ready for the biggest game of my son's Little League season. I've been keeping detailed moon charts for 2 years now, ever since that camping trip to the Adirondacks went sideways, and I came back home with bite marks that wouldn't heal properly. Most people use their phone's calendar app to track appointments and deadlines. I use mine to calculate exactly when I need to lock myself in my reinforced basement and wait for the beast to run its course. The system had worked perfectly for 24 months. Every full moon, I'd manufacture some excuse. Food poisoning, work emergency, out-of-town business trip, and Jake would spend those nights at his mother's place while I transformed safely in isolation. Carol never questioned it. If anything, she seemed relieved to have extra custody time that she could use to paint me as the unreliable ex-husband who was always canceling plans. This morning's calculations had been triple-checked. Moonrise at 8:47 p.m., sunset at 7:23 p.m. The championship game was scheduled for 6:00 p.m., with an estimated completion time of 7:45 p.m. Even accounting for extra innings or delays, we'd be safely home with Jake tucked into bed at his mother's apartment before the moon cleared the horizon. I should have factored in atmospheric refraction. Jake had been bouncing off the walls with excitement all week. The Riverside Ravens versus the Millfield Mustangs for the district championship. He was starting at first base, his best position, the one where his height advantage really showed. At 8 years old, he was already tall for his age, with my long legs and his mother's athletic coordination. "Dad, you're still coming to the game, right?" He'd asked me for the 10th time this morning over his cereal. Coach Martinez said I might get to bat cleanup if Tommy's shoulder is still bothering him. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, buddy," I'd promised, ruffling his dark hair. And I'd meant it. Since the divorce 18 months ago, I'd attended every single one of Jake's games. It was one of the few things Carol and I didn't fight about. She knew how important these moments were to both Jake and me. The irony wasn't lost on me that my supernatural condition had actually made me a better father in some ways. When you know you only have a limited number of safe days each month to spend with your son, you tend to make them count. Every normal human moment became precious. Teaching him to throw a curveball, helping with math homework, watching him discover that he could make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs if you poured the batter just right. I'd even volunteered to be assistant coach this season, something Carol had been nagging me to do for years. "Jake needs to see you involved in his activities," she'd say during our tense custody exchanges, "not just showing up as a spectator." Coach Martinez had been thrilled to have an extra pair of hands. Luis Martinez was a good man, worked at the fire station, had twin boys on the team, knew how to balance fun with fundamentals. He'd made me responsible for base coaching and keeping the team's statistics, jobs that perfectly suited my detail-oriented personality. The only downside was how much I'd started to care about these kids. Not just Jake, but all of them. Tommy Rodriguez with his cannon arm and chronic shoulder problems. Emma Chen, the only girl on the team who could outrun half the boys. Marcus Williams, Jake's best friend who was afraid of pop flies but could bunt like a professional. When you're a monster, and I don't use that word lightly, caring about people becomes dangerous. Every month, I had to lock myself away and let something savage and uncontrollable loose in my basement. The thing that I became during those transformations didn't recognize family bonds or friendship. It only understood hunger and hunt and kill. So far, I'd managed to keep those two worlds completely separate. Tom Brennan, the father, existed during the day, under human skies. The wolf existed at night, under the full moon, safely contained behind steel-reinforced doors and silver-lined walls that I'd had specially installed by contractors who didn't ask too many questions. The championship game was supposed to be a celebration of how well that system worked. One perfect evening where I could focus entirely on being Jake's dad, cheering him on from the dugout, maybe taking him out for ice cream afterward to celebrate their victory. I should have checked the weather forecast. The game started perfectly. Riverside Little League's diamond looked like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Freshly mowed grass, crisp white baselines, parents filling the bleachers with folding chairs and coolers full of snacks. The late afternoon sun cast everything in that golden light that makes even routine pop flies look heroic. Jake was nervous during warm-ups. I could smell it on him, the sharp scent of adrenaline mixed with deodorant and bubblegum, but he was also excited, practically vibrating with anticipation as he took practice swings with his lucky bat. "Remember what we worked on," I called to him from the dugout. "Keep your eye on the ball, trust your hands, and don't try to kill it. Base hits win games." He flashed me a gap-toothed grin and nodded. "Got it, Dad." The first 6 innings were everything a championship game should be. Both teams played clean, aggressive baseball. The score stayed close, 3-2 Ravens heading into the bottom of the 7th. Jake had already gotten 2 hits, including a double that drove in the go-ahead run in the 5th inning. I was having the time of my life. This was what normal felt like, standing in a dugout full of excited kids, keeping score in a beat-up notebook, high-fiving 8-year-olds who were living their baseball dreams one swing at a time. That's when the first warning signs hit. It started as a tingling in my fingertips around 7:15 p.m., about 30 minutes earlier than it should have based on my calculations. I checked my phone's moon app, but it still showed moonrise at 8:47. Maybe I was just nervous about the game, I told myself. Sometimes stress could trigger phantom symptoms, but then my sense of smell sharpened dramatically. I could suddenly detect every individual scent in the ballpark. Hot dogs and mustard from the concession stand, the rubber and leather of baseball gloves, the different brands of detergent used to wash 23 different uniforms, the nervousness and excitement radiating from kids and parents alike. Most disturbing of all, I could smell something that didn't belong at a Little League game. The musk of a large predator, somewhere close by. "Coach Brennan?" Emma Chen was tugging on my sleeve. "Are you okay? You look kind of pale." I forced a smile and nodded. "Just focused on the game, sweetheart. You ready to get up there and show them your fastball?" Emma was our closing pitcher, brought in during the 7th inning to seal victories. She had a nasty changeup that consistently fooled batters who were expecting her to throw hard. Under normal circumstances, watching her work would be pure enjoyment, but these weren't normal circumstances. As Emma took the mound for the top of the 7th, I felt the second wave of symptoms hit. My joints began to ache, not the sharp pain of injury, but the deep, bone-level discomfort that meant structural changes were beginning. I checked my phone again. 7:38 p.m. Still over an hour before moonrise according to every app and website I could access. But my body was telling a different story. That's when I noticed the moon. It was just barely visible in the darkening sky, a pale disk rising over the tree line beyond the outfield fence. Rising at least 20 minutes earlier than predicted, made visible by perfect atmospheric conditions that had magnified and refracted its light, perfect conditions that I hadn't accounted for in my careful calculations. "Shit," I whispered, then immediately looked around to make sure none of the kids had heard me swear. I had maybe 15 minutes before the transformation became unstoppable. 15 minutes to get away from this ballpark full of children and parents, to get somewhere isolated where I could lock myself away until dawn. But Jake was scheduled to bat third in our half of the 7th inning, the biggest at-bat of his young baseball career, with the championship on the line. If I left now, he'd spend the rest of his life wondering why his father had abandoned him during the most important game he'd ever played. "Coach Martinez," I called over to Luis. I think I might be getting sick. Food poisoning or something. Can you handle the rest of the game if I need to step out?" Luis looked at me with concern. "You do look pretty rough, Tom. Go ahead and take off. I've got this covered." "Feel better, man." I started toward the dugout exit, but Jake caught my arm as I passed the bench. "Dad, where are you going?" "I'm up in 2 batters." The hope in his voice nearly broke my heart. This was his moment. His chance to be the hero in front of all his friends and teammates. And I was about to walk away from it because of something I couldn't control or explain. "I'll be right back, buddy," I lied. "Just need to use the bathroom. Hit a home run for me, okay?" Jake nodded eagerly and turned back to watch Emma strike out the Mustang's cleanup hitter. I made it 3 steps toward the parking lot before the 3rd wave of symptoms hit. This time it wasn't just tingling or joint pain. I could feel my skeleton beginning to shift. Vertebrae extending, ribs expanding, jaw pushing forward. The transformation was starting whether I was ready or not. I stumbled behind the concession stand, hoping to find some privacy while I figured out what to do. But there were parents everywhere, getting snacks, using the restroom, gathering near the fence to watch their kids play. No matter which direction I turned, I was surrounded by potential witnesses. "Tom! Tom Brennan!" I turned to see Mike Henderson approaching from the parking lot. Mike was another dad from the team. His son Derek played right field and was always good for comic relief during practice. Mike worked in construction, was recently divorced like me, and we'd bonded over the challenges of single parenting. "Hey, Mike," I managed, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pain that was beginning to spike through my spine. "Great game, huh? Oh, it's about to get a lot more interesting," Mike said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's when I caught his scent. The same predatory musk I'd been detecting for the past 20 minutes. It wasn't coming from somewhere else in the ballpark. It was coming from Mike. "You smell it too, don't you?" Mike continued conversationally. "That change in the air when the moon rises early throws off all your careful planning." My blood went cold as I realized what he was telling me. Mike Henderson wasn't just another divorced dad struggling to connect with his kid. He was like me, another werewolf, another monster trying to live a normal life. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, backing away slowly. Mike laughed, but it was entirely humorless. "Come on, Tom. We've been watching you for months. The way you never schedule anything during full moons. How you always seem to know when it's going to rain before the weather report. The way you flinch whenever someone mentions camping trips or hiking. Watching me, there's a whole network of us, Tom. People who've learned to manage the condition, who figured out how to live normal lives most of the time. We help each other, share information, provide alibis when necessary, clean up messes when someone loses control." The pain in my spine was getting worse, and I could feel my canine teeth beginning to extend. "I don't need help. I have everything under control. Do you?" Mike glanced toward the baseball diamond, where Jake was walking to the on-deck circle. "Because from where I'm standing, you're about to transform in front of 50 witnesses, including your own son. Doesn't seem very controlled to me." He was right, and we both knew it. I had maybe 5 minutes before the change became visible to anyone watching. Once that happened, there would be no covering it up, no explaining it away as a medical emergency. "What do you want?" I asked. "Help you, obviously." There's a service road behind those trees that leads to an abandoned quarry, completely isolated. No chance of anyone stumbling across us while we ride out the transformation. Your son will think you had to leave because of food poisoning. It's disappointing, but not traumatic. It sounded reasonable. More than reasonable. It sounded like salvation. Mike was offering me exactly what I needed most. A way to get through this crisis without destroying Jake's life or exposing our supernatural nature to the world. But something about his manner set off every alarm bell I possessed. Maybe it was the way he kept checking his watch, or how he seemed more excited than concerned about our mutual predicament. "There's just one small complication," Mike continued. "The network has rules about exposure. Anyone who transforms in public, anyone who risks revealing what we are, they become a liability that needs to be handled." "Handled how?" Mike's smile became genuinely predatory. "Well, that depends. Sometimes people can be relocated, given new identities, moved to communities where they can start fresh under proper supervision. But sometimes," he shrugged, "sometimes the risk is too great to manage." I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. Mike and his network had been monitoring me, waiting for me to make a mistake that would give them justification to eliminate me. "You orchestrated this," I realized. "You knew the moon would rise early tonight. You knew I'd be here, trapped with no way to escape without exposing myself." "Atmospheric refraction," Mike confirmed. "Tricky thing to calculate unless you really know what you're looking for. Most amateur lycanthropes just use basic moon phase apps, but we've been doing this for decades. We know all the variables." The bastard had set me up, used my love for my son against me, knowing I'd never miss Jake's championship game even if it meant risking exposure. "So, what happens now?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Now we go to the quarry like I suggested, but instead of riding out the transformation together, I make sure you don't survive it. Then I come back here, express concern that you seemed sick and left suddenly. Maybe help search for you when you don't come home tonight." Mike was already changing. Not the dramatic Hollywood transformation, but the subtle early stages that I recognized from my own monthly ordeal. His face was becoming more angular, his eyes reflecting light they shouldn't be able to catch. And Jake gets a tragic story about how his father had some kind of medical emergency and died suddenly. Very sad, but these things happen. He'll be fine. Kids are resilient. That's when something snapped inside me. Not the werewolf change. Something deeper and more fundamental. Mike could threaten me all he wanted, but the moment he started talking about Jake's future like it was just collateral damage, he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "No," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" I said no. "You want to kill me? Fine. But you don't get to decide what happens to my son. And you sure as hell don't get to do it at his championship game." Mike laughed. "Tom, you're in no position to negotiate. In about 3 minutes, you're going to start transforming whether you want to or not. I can either kill you quickly and privately, or let you change in front of all these nice families and then kill you publicly. Your choice." He was right about the timing. I could feel my bones beginning to reshape in earnest now, my human form starting to give way to something larger and infinitely more dangerous. But he was wrong about my options. Instead of trying to flee or hide, I started walking back toward the baseball diamond. Tom, what are you doing?" Mike called after me, panic creeping into his voice. I ignored him and kept walking. If I was going to transform in public, if this was going to be the end of my carefully constructed normal life, then at least I was going to do it on my terms. Jake was in the batter's box now, taking practice swings while the Mustang's pitcher warmed up. The count was full after 5 pitches, everything riding on the next throw. I could see the determination on his face, the focus that reminded me so much of his mother. That's when the real transformation began. It started in my hands, fingers elongating, nails becoming claws, palms stretching to accommodate a completely different bone structure. Then my feet, bursting out of my sneakers as they reshaped themselves for 4-legged locomotion. Parents in the stands started pointing and screaming. Someone shouted, "Call 911!" Another voice yelled, "Get the kids away from him!" But I barely heard them. All my attention was focused on Jake, who had stepped out of the batter's box and was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crowd's panic. "Dad, what's happening to you?" I tried to answer him, tried to explain that I was still his father despite what he was seeing, but my vocal cords had already changed too much for human speech. The only sound that came out was a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo across the entire ballpark. That's when Mike appeared beside me, also in mid-transformation but much further along than I was. His change was smooth and controlled, the work of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "You stupid bastard," he snarled through a muzzle that was almost fully formed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? How many people are going to have to die to clean this up?" But as Mike lunged toward me, something unexpected happened. Jake didn't run. Instead, he picked up his aluminum baseball bat and stepped between us. "Get away from my dad," he shouted, swinging the bat with all the strength his 8-year-old arms could muster. The bat connected with Mike's shoulder, barely slowing him down but demonstrating something that made my transforming heart swell with pride. My son was brave, even faced with something beyond his understanding, even terrified out of his mind. He was trying to protect me. That gave me the motivation I needed to fight back. Mike might have been more experienced at controlling his transformations, but I had something he didn't, a reason to win that went beyond simple survival. I had Jake to protect, and a dozen other kids who were too scared to run, and parents who were trapped between the field and the parking lot. We crashed together in a tangle of claws and teeth, rolling across the pitcher's mound while the crowd scattered in all directions. Mike was trying to go for my throat, but I managed to get my arms up in time to block his attack. The fight was brutal and primal. 2 monsters tearing at each other while children screamed and parents called for help. But it was also strangely liberating. For 2 years, I'd been suppressing the wolf, locking it away, pretending it didn't exist. Now, for the first time, I was letting it fight for something that mattered. Mike was stronger and more skilled, but I was desperate. And desperation can overcome a lot of disadvantages. I managed to get my jaws around his throat just as he raked his claws across my ribs. The pain was incredible, but I held on, applying pressure until I felt something give way. Mike went limp in my arms, his transformation reversing as he lost consciousness. Within seconds, he was just a man again, unconscious and bleeding, but human. I released my grip and staggered backward, my own change beginning to reverse now that the immediate threat was over. But the damage was done. 50 people had just watched 2 men turn into monsters and fight to the death on a Little League baseball field. As my human form reasserted itself, I found myself naked and bloody in the middle of the pitcher's mound, surrounded by overturned equipment and confused, terrified faces. Jake was the first to approach me. He dropped his bat and was walking slowly across the infield, his young face cycling through fear and confusion, and something that might have been recognition. "Dad?" he said tentatively. Are you okay?" I wanted to tell him I was fine, that everything was going to be all right, but we both knew that wasn't true. Nothing was ever going to be all right again. "Jake," I managed, my voice hoarse from the transformation. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Can you do that?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sick, buddy. I've been sick for a long time, but I didn't want you to know because I didn't want you to be scared. But now everyone knows, and things are going to have to change." "What kind of sick?" Jake asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already suspected the answer. "The kind where sometimes I turn into something that's not safe to be around. The kind where I might hurt people I love without meaning to." Jake looked around the destroyed ballpark, at the scattered crowd of parents and kids who were keeping their distance but still watching us. "Is that why you and Mom got divorced?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "No, buddy. Your mom doesn't know about this. We got divorced because sometimes grown-ups just can't figure out how to be happy together. But this is different." I could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called the police, probably animal control too. Within minutes, this place would be swarming with people who would have questions I couldn't answer and solutions I couldn't accept. "Jake," I said urgently, "I need you to go to your mom now. Don't look back. Don't try to help me. Just go. Can you do that?" "I don't want to leave you, Dad. I know. But this is how you help me. By being safe. By being with your mom where I know nothing bad can happen to you." Jake hesitated for a moment, then threw his arms around me in a fierce hug. "I love you, Dad. Even if you're sick, even if you turn into that thing, I still love you." I held him as tightly as I dared, knowing it would probably be the last time. "I love you too, buddy. More than all the stars in the sky." Then I gently pushed him away and watched him run toward the stands where Carol was waiting with a mixture of horror and maternal instinct on her face. As the sirens got closer, I made my decision. Mike was still unconscious but breathing. He'd survived to answer questions about what had happened here, but I couldn't stick around to be part of those conversations. I gathered up Mike's discarded clothes and put them on. Oh, they were too small, but better than being naked when the authorities arrived. Then I started walking toward the woods beyond the outfield fence. Behind me, I could hear Jake calling my name one last time, but I didn't turn around. Some goodbyes are too hard to face directly. The story that made it into the newspapers was surprisingly close to the truth. "Animal attack at youth baseball game" was the headline, with details about how 2 men had apparently been mauled by some kind of large predator that had wandered onto the field during the championship game. One of the men, Mike Henderson, had been hospitalized with severe lacerations, but was expected to make a full recovery. The other, Tom Brennan, had disappeared and was presumed dead, his body likely dragged off by whatever creature had attacked them. There were some inconsistencies in witness accounts, of course. Some people swore they'd seen the men actually transform into animals before fighting each other. But trauma does strange things to memory, and most people were willing to accept the official explanation rather than deal with the alternative. Jake handled the whole thing better than anyone expected. He told his mother that he'd seen something attack his father, but when pressed for details, his story remained vague and childlike. Kids are remarkably adaptable when it comes to processing experiences that don't fit into their understanding of how the world works. Carol moved them to a different town about 6 months later, a fresh start where Jake wouldn't be known as the kid whose father was killed by a wild animal at the baseball game. She enrolled him in a new little league, got him into counseling, did all the things a good mother does to help her child heal from trauma. I followed them, of course. Not closely. I'm not a stalker, but close enough to keep an eye on things, to make sure Jake was safe and adjusting to his new normal. He grew up to be a remarkable young man. Good student, star athlete, kind to animals and younger kids. Everything a father could hope for in a son. Carol remarried when he was 12. A decent man who treated Jake like his own flesh and blood. I attended his high school graduation from the back row, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses so no one would recognize me. Watched him give the valedictorian speech, accept a full scholarship to college, hug his mother and stepfather with genuine affection. He looked happy, stable, like a kid who'd processed his childhood trauma and moved on to build something positive from the pieces. That's when I finally allowed myself to believe I'd made the right choice. The network Mike had mentioned turned out to be real, though not quite as sinister as he'd made it sound. They found me about a year after the baseball game incident. A community of people learning to manage lycanthropy while maintaining some semblance of normal life. They offered me structure, support, a chance to use my experience to help other newly infected people avoid the mistakes I'd made. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was meaningful work. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. If I tried to explain everything to Carol and Jake, trusted them to love me, despite what I'd become, maybe we could have made it work. Found some way to be a family even with the monthly complications. But then I remember the terror in Jake's eyes when he watched me transform, the way he stepped between me and Mike with nothing but an aluminum bat for protection. Some love is too precious to risk on, maybe. My son is 26 now. He's a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital, married to a wonderful woman who makes him laugh, father to twin daughters who have his eyes and his mother's smile. He sends Christmas cards to Tom Brennan at a P.O. box I maintain, never knowing that his supposedly dead father reads every word and keeps every photo. The return address is always the same, and Jake always signs the cards the same way. Missing you, Dad. Hope you're at peace. I am at peace. Jake, because of you, because of the choice you helped me make that night at the ballpark, I found a way to live with what I am without destroying what I love most. Some fathers miss their kids' games because of work schedules or divorce complications or simple lack of interest. Others miss them because staying means their children might not survive the night. What would you sacrifice to keep your child safe? What would you give up to make sure they could grow up without fear, without the shadow of your mistakes hanging over their future? Think about that the next time you're tempted to put your own needs ahead of someone you love. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away, even when walking away breaks your heart into a million pieces. And if you ever find yourself at a Little League game, watching kids play baseball under lights that make everything look magical and innocent, take a moment to appreciate how normal that moment is. How many people would give anything to be able to sit in those bleachers without worrying about what might happen when the moon rises early? Some of us can only love our children from a distance, but we love them just the same. The hiking trail I'd been using for months was finally closed by park rangers, but not because of bear attacks, because someone kept finding piles of shredded clothes that still smelled like wet dog. I was staring at the yellow tape stretched across the Whispering Pines trailhead when I realized those weren't random pieces of fabric I'd been stepping over during my morning runs. They were what was left of people. People who'd made the same mistake I was about to make by ignoring that closure sign. But let me back up to 6 months ago, when I was just Derek Castellano, insurance adjuster and weekend warrior, looking for a way to not completely lose my mind in a job that was slowly killing my soul. Working insurance claims is like being a professional skeptic. 8 hours a day, I investigated people's worst moments. House fires, car accidents, slip and fall incidents, medical emergencies. My job was to find reasons to deny coverage, to poke holes in stories, to assume everyone was lying until proven otherwise. It's not that I enjoyed ruining people's lives, but after 5 years of processing fraudulent claims and exaggerated damages, cynicism becomes a survival mechanism. You learn to trust nothing and question everything, which is probably why I ignored so many warning signs on the Whispering Pines trail. I discovered the trail during one of my mandatory mental health breaks that my supervisor, Dr. Chen, insisted I take after my third stress-related incident in 2 months. Derek, she'd said, you need to find some way to decompress that doesn't involve drinking alone in your apartment. So, I'd started hiking. Nothing serious at first, just weekend walks in the state park near my apartment complex. But as my stress levels decreased and my physical fitness improved, I began seeking out more challenging terrain. The Whispering Pines Trail was perfect for my needs. It was remote enough to provide real solitude, challenging enough to require focus and effort, but not so difficult that I needed special equipment. The trailhead was only a 30-minute drive from downtown, making it perfect for early morning runs before work. Most importantly, I almost never encountered other hikers. The trail wasn't listed on popular hiking websites, didn't appear in guidebooks, and wasn't marked with the usual Forest Service signs. I'd found it purely by accident, following an old logging road that branched off from a more established trail system. For the first few months, my morning routine was absolutely perfect. I'd arrive at the trailhead around 6 a.m., run the 5-mile loop through dense forest and rocky outcroppings, and be back at my apartment by 8 a.m. with enough time to shower and grab coffee before work. The exercise helped me sleep better, think more clearly, and deal with the constant stress of investigating human misery for profit. Those early morning runs became the only part of my day that I genuinely looked forward to. The first time I found torn clothing, I barely paid attention to it. A piece of blue fabric caught on a thorn bush about 2 miles into the trail. Could have been from anyone's jacket or shirt, torn off during a careless moment. I picked it up, intending to throw it away at the trailhead, but forgot about it by the time I finished my run. The second incident was a week later. A white sneaker lying beside the trail, laces still tied but looking like it had been forcibly removed from someone's foot. The rubber sole was scratched and gouged in a way that suggested violent separation from its owner. I should have been more concerned, but insurance work trains you to look for patterns before drawing conclusions. 2 isolated incidents could mean anything. Careless hikers, practical jokers, teenagers partying in the woods and leaving debris behind. It was the third discovery that should have sent me running in the opposite direction. I found a complete set of clothes: jeans, t-shirt, underwear, socks, neatly arranged beside a large boulder as if someone had carefully undressed and folded their garments before. Before what? The clothes weren't torn or damaged, just abandoned. But they were still damp with morning dew, meaning they'd been left recently. Standing there looking at that pile of clothes, I had 2 choices. I could report it to park rangers and probably lose access to my favorite trail while they conducted some kind of investigation. Or I could assume there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone had gone skinny dipping in the creek, or decided to change into better hiking gear, or was playing some kind of elaborate prank. I chose logic over intuition, which in hindsight was probably the worst decision I've ever made. The discoveries continued over the following weeks. Always clothes, always in different locations along the trail, always arranged in ways that suggested intentional placement rather than accidental loss. Sometimes they were torn and blood-stained. Sometimes they were clean and neatly folded. But they were always there, like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the forest. And there was always that smell, a musky, animal scent that reminded me of wet dog fur mixed with something sharper and more metallic. I told myself it was just the natural odor of decomposing leaves and stagnant creek water, but deep down I knew it was something else. The strangest part was how good I felt during this period. Despite finding increasingly disturbing evidence that something was wrong in these woods, my stress levels continued to drop. I was sleeping better, eating better, performing better at work. Dr. Chen commented on how much more relaxed I seemed during our monthly check-ins. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "keep doing it. This is the most balanced I've seen you since you started working here." So I kept hiking the Whispering Pines Trail, stepping over evidence of something, while convincing myself that ignorance was preferable to investigation. For once in my professional life, I chose not to dig deeper into obvious inconsistencies. That willful blindness lasted until I started seeing the tracks. They appeared after a heavy rainstorm in early October, pressed deep into the muddy sections of the trail. At first glance, they looked like large dog prints, maybe from a German Shepherd or similar breed. but they were bigger than any domestic dog tracks I'd ever seen, with claw marks that extended much further from the pads than seemed natural. More disturbing was the pattern. The tracks didn't follow the wandering path of an animal exploring its territory. They followed the exact route of the hiking trail, from the trailhead to the turnaround point and back, like something was deliberately patrolling the area. I started carrying my phone on runs, taking pictures of the clearest tracks and comparing them to images online. The closest matches I found were for wolves, but wolves had been extinct in this part of the country for over a century. That's when I made my second major mistake. Instead of staying away from the trail until I figured out what was leaving those tracks, I became obsessed with solving the mystery. I started varying my hiking times, arriving at different hours to see if I could observe whatever was creating the evidence I'd been finding. Early morning runs became afternoon hikes, then evening walks. Finally, late-night explorations with a headlamp and a camera, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature that was clearly using this trail as its territory. I never saw anything directly, but the signs became more frequent and more disturbing. Scratch marks on tree trunks, too high and too deep for any normal animal. Bones scattered in clearings, picked clean but arranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. And always that musky, metallic smell that grew stronger during certain phases of the moon. The trail officially closed on a Thursday morning in late October. I arrived at the trailhead to find yellow tape across the entrance and a Forest Service sign warning hikers to stay away due to dangerous wildlife activity. "Can I help you?" I turned to find a park ranger approaching from a patrol vehicle I hadn't noticed. He was middle-aged, weathered from years of outdoor work, with the kind of serious expression that suggested he'd seen things that weren't covered in the employee handbook. "I was just planning to do my morning run," I said, gesturing toward the closed trail. "I've been using this trail for months. What kind of dangerous wildlife are we talking about?" The ranger studied me for a moment, like he was deciding how much to reveal.
"You've been hiking here regularly?"
"Almost every day for the past 6 months. Never had any problems. You ever see anything unusual? Animals acting strange? Evidence of large predators? Anything that seemed out of place?" I thought about the torn clothes, the oversized tracks, the arranged bones. Maybe some signs of large animals, but nothing that seemed immediately dangerous. "What happened?" "We've had 3 missing person reports in the past month. All hikers who were last seen heading toward this trail. Search teams found." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say they found evidence of animal attacks. Attacks by something much larger and more aggressive than anything that's supposed to live in these woods. Mountain lion, maybe?" I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't what had been leaving those tracks. The ranger shook his head. "Mountain lions don't typically attack humans unless cornered or protecting cubs. And they don't arrange their kills the way we've been finding them. Whatever's been hunting in these woods shows signs of intelligence, planning, like it's using the trail system to funnel prey into specific areas." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what he was describing. Something intelligent enough to use human hiking patterns against them. Something that understood the trail layout well enough to predict where hikers would be vulnerable. "How long is the closure expected to last?" I asked. "Indefinitely. Fish and Wildlife is bringing in a team of specialists to track and relocate whatever's been causing the problems. Until then, this entire section of forest is off limits to civilian access." I should have thanked the ranger, driven home, and found a new place to exercise. Any rational person would have respected the closure and stayed far away from an area where people had been killed by some kind of unknown predator. But I wasn't feeling particularly rational. The Whispering Pines Trail had become central to my mental health routine. Without those morning runs, I could feel my stress levels climbing and my job performance declining. After just 3 days of using a crowded gym instead of my peaceful forest trail, I was already having trouble sleeping, so I started parking at a different access point. an old logging road about a mile south of the official trailhead that connected to the same trail system. The closure signs only covered the main entrance, and I reasoned that I wasn't technically violating any regulations by accessing public land from a different direction. Besides, if there really was some kind of dangerous animal in the area, my presence might actually help. I could serve as an unofficial scout, reporting any signs of unusual activity to the authorities. It was practically a public service. At least, that's how I justified it to myself as I laced up my running shoes and headed into the woods that Friday morning. The trail felt different, knowing it was supposed to be closed. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of twigs under my feet, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of birds I couldn't identify. The familiar musky scent was stronger than usual, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more frequently than normal. But I also felt a sense of ownership that hadn't been there before. This was my trail now, my secret refuge from the stress of civilization. No other hikers to worry about. No need to step aside or make small talk. Just me in the forest, exactly the way I preferred it. I was about 3 miles into my run when I encountered the first sign that I wasn't alone. The smell hit me first. That familiar musk, but much stronger and more recent. Fresh enough that whatever was producing it had passed through the area within the last hour or two. Then I saw the tracks. Not the old, weathered prints I'd been documenting for weeks, but fresh impressions in the soft earth beside the creek crossing. Multiple sets of tracks, all similar in size and shape, leading from the water up toward the ridgeline. As I knelt down to examine the prints more closely, I heard voices approaching from the direction I'd just come. Multiple people, moving through the forest with considerably less stealth than I would have expected from park rangers or wildlife officials. I stepped off the trail and crouched behind a cluster of fallen logs, curious to see who else was ignoring the closure order. Through the trees, I could make out 3 figures approaching. All male, all dressed in camouflage hunting gear, all carrying rifles. Trail's fresher here, one of them said as they paused near the creek crossing. Maybe 2 hours old, heading up toward the ridge. Good, replied another voice. We can use the high ground to get ahead of it, set up an ambush at the narrows. The third man was examining the same tracks I'd just been studying. These are definitely from our target. Size matches, claw configuration is right, and the spacing suggests it's moving at a casual pace. Not spooked yet. Hunters. Of course. The park closure had probably attracted every amateur predator tracker in the state. People who saw missing hikers as an excuse to play hero with high-powered rifles. I should have been relieved that someone was actually taking action to eliminate whatever had been killing people on my trail. Instead, I felt oddly protective of the creature they were hunting. The Whispering Pines Trail had been my sanctuary for months, and these men felt like intruders in a space that belonged to me. "Excuse me," I said, stepping out from behind the logs. "Are you guys with Fish and Wildlife?" All 3 men spun toward me, rifles not quite pointed in my direction but ready to move quickly if I turned out to be a threat. They were older than I'd initially thought, probably in their 40s or 50s, with the kind of weathered faces and confident postures that suggested extensive outdoor experience. Private contractors. The first man replied after a moment. Hired by the county to track and eliminate the animal that's been causing problems in this area. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance. His companions were younger but carried themselves with similar professional confidence. "I didn't know the county was using contractors for this," I said. "Emergency situation," the second man explained. "Fish and Wildlife is understaffed, and every day this thing remains loose. More hikers are at risk. We have experience dealing with problematic predators." That seemed reasonable enough. I'd worked enough insurance claims involving animal attacks to know that government agencies were often slow to respond to wildlife emergencies. "You shouldn't be out here," the third man added. Trails closed for a reason. This animal has already killed 3 people, and it's getting bolder, more aggressive. I've been hiking this trail for months, I said. Never had any problems. What exactly are you tracking? The 3 men exchanged glances, like they were deciding how much information to share with a civilian. Large canine, the first man finally said. Probably a wolf-dog hybrid that's reverted to wild behavior. Unusually intelligent, which makes it more dangerous than a typical predator. It's been using the trail system to hunt humans systematically. Wolf-dog hybrid? That would explain the oversized tracks and the intelligence the ranger had mentioned. I thought wolves were extinct around here. Officially, they are, the second man said. But there's a black market for wolf-dog crosses among people who want exotic pets. When these animals get too large or aggressive to handle, owners sometimes release them into the wild rather than having them properly euthanized. It made sense. I'd investigated insurance claims involving exotic pets before. People who bought baby tigers or chimpanzees without understanding what they were committing to long-term. When the cute baby animal became a dangerous adult predator, abandonment was unfortunately common. Have you actually seen this animal? I asked. Briefly. The third man replied. Last night, just before dawn. It was smart enough to stay at the edge of our light range, but we got a general idea of size and behavior. Definitely a large canine, moving with purpose rather than random hunting patterns. That's why we need to get ahead of it today, the first man added. Set up a kill shot before it has a chance to claim another victim. I found myself nodding along with their plan. These men clearly knew what they were doing, and eliminating a dangerous predator would allow my trail to reopen safely. I know this trail system better than anyone, I heard myself saying. If you want to get ahead of your target, I can show you the best positioning spots. The 3 men looked at each other again, and I got the feeling they were having some kind of silent conversation. That's generous of you, the first man said finally. But this could be dangerous work. We don't want to put a civilian at risk. I'm not asking to participate in the actual hunt, I clarified. Just point you toward the most strategic locations. I've been running this trail almost daily for 6 months. I know every ridge, every clearing, every bottleneck where you could set up an effective shot. After another moment of silent consultation, the first man nodded. All right, but you follow our lead. Stay exactly where we tell you to stay. And if things go sideways, you run toward the trailhead and don't look back. Understood. I'm Marcus, he said, extending his hand. This is Leo and Vincent. I shook hands with each of them, noting that their grips were unusually strong and their skin was rougher than I would have expected from weekend hunters. Derek, I replied, and I really appreciate what you're doing. This trail means a lot to me. We understand, Leo said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sometimes a place becomes important to you in ways that are hard to explain to other people. We spent the next hour hiking deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before, following game trails and ridge lines that weren't marked on any map. Marcus seemed to know exactly where he was going, moving through unfamiliar terrain with the confidence of someone who'd been here many times before. The tracks we were following became more frequent as we climbed higher, joined by additional sets that suggested we were dealing with more than one animal. Pack behavior, Vincent explained when I pointed this out. Wolf-dog hybrids sometimes form loose social groups, especially if they were raised together before being released. That was concerning. Multiple large predators working together would be much more dangerous than a single animal, and much harder to eliminate safely. How many are we talking about? I asked, based on the track evidence. Probably 3 or 4 adults. Marcus replied. Maybe more. They've been coordinating their hunts, using the trail system to drive prey toward predetermined kill sites. We reached a ridge overlooking a narrow section of the main trail where hikers would be forced to pass single file between large rock formations. It was perfect ambush terrain. Nowhere to run, limited visibility, natural sound barriers that would muffle any calls for help. "This is it," Leo said, setting down his pack and pulling out a pair of binoculars. "Perfect kill zone. They'll have to come through that bottleneck, and we'll have clear shots from multiple angles." I studied the terrain below us, and something about the setup bothered me. The rock formations were natural, but the cleared areas around them looked almost managed, like someone had deliberately removed undergrowth to create better sight lines and easier movement. "Have other hunters been working this area?" I asked. "What makes you ask that?" Marcus said, his tone suddenly sharper. "The clearing patterns look artificial, like someone's been maintaining this space for hunting purposes." Vincent laughed, but it sounded forced. "You've got a good eye." "Yeah, we've been working this territory for a few months now. Had to clear some brush to create effective shooting positions." That explained the artificial appearance, but it also raised new questions. If these men had been hunting here for months, why hadn't they eliminated the predator already? How had they gotten permission to clear vegetation on public land? And why did they seem more familiar with this terrain than I was, despite my months of regular hiking? "Derek," Marcus said, interrupting my thoughts, "we need you to do something for us. Take this radio and hike back down to the main trail. If you see or hear anything moving in your direction, let us know immediately. We need early warning if the pack tries to circle around behind us." He handed me a small two-way radio and pointed toward a game trail that led back down the ridge. "Stay on that path. Keep the radio on channel 3, and don't try to engage with anything you might encounter. Just observe and report." It seemed like a reasonable request, and I was happy to help eliminate the threat that had closed my favorite hiking trail. I clipped the radio to my belt and started down the narrow path Marcus had indicated. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I heard the first howl. It was long and mournful, echoing off the rock formations in a way that made it impossible to determine the direction or distance. But it definitely wasn't coming from a domestic dog. This was something wild and large, calling to others of its kind. The howl was answered by 2 more voices, then 3, then so many I lost count. Whatever we were dealing with, it was much bigger than a pack of 3 or 4 animals. I keyed the radio. "Marcus, are you hearing this?" Static for a moment, then his voice. "Copy that, Derek. Sounds like they're moving toward your position. Can you see anything?" I scanned the forest around me but saw nothing unusual. The howling had stopped, leaving the woods eerily quiet in a way that made every nerve in my body scream danger. "Negative on visual contact," I reported. "But something feels wrong. The forest has gone completely silent." "That's normal predator behavior," Marcus replied. "All the prey animals go quiet when apex predators are moving through their territory. Just stay calm and keep your eyes open." But as I stood there listening to the unnatural silence, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The howling hadn't sounded like it was coming from the forest below me. It had sounded like it was coming from the ridge above me, from the exact area where Marcus, Leo, and Vincent had set up their ambush position. I keyed the radio again. "Marcus, was that howling coming from your position?" No response. "Marcus? Leo? Vincent? Please respond." Still nothing but static. I started climbing back up the ridge, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. If the predators had somehow gotten behind the hunters, I might be walking into an active attack situation. But I couldn't just abandon 3 men who were risking their lives to make the trail safe. As I got closer to the ambush position, I began to smell that familiar musky scent, but much stronger than I'd ever experienced before. It was overwhelming, like being inside a kennel full of wet dogs, mixed with something metallic and sharp that made my eyes water. I crept up to the edge of the clearing where we'd set up the ambush, expecting to see the hunters scanning the forest below for signs of their quarry. Instead, I found myself looking at something that made my rational mind simply shut down for several seconds. Marcus, Leo, and Vincent were still there. But they weren't human anymore. They were in various stages of transformation into something that was part wolf, part human, and entirely wrong. Marcus was the furthest along, standing upright but covered in dark fur, his face elongated into a muzzle full of teeth that were definitely not designed for eating vegetation. Leo and Vincent were still changing, their clothes shredded and hanging in tatters, their bones cracking and reshaping with sounds that made me physically nauseous. But their eyes remained human. Watching me with intelligence and what might have been amusement. "Derek," Marcus said in a voice that was barely recognizable as human. "Thanks for waiting around. We were hoping you'd come back. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey my brain's commands. I could only stand there and stare as the three men, creatures, things, completed their transformation into something out of a nightmare." "You look confused," Leo observed, his words distorted by a mouth that was no longer the right shape for human speech. "Let me explain what's been happening." Vincent, now fully transformed, began circling around behind me with the fluid grace of a natural predator. "The Whispering Pines Trail has been our hunting ground for over 2 years, he said. "Perfect location, remote enough for privacy, but popular enough with hikers to provide regular meals." "Meals?" I managed to whisper. "Those missing hikers the ranger told you about," Marcus explained. "They weren't killed by some random wild animal. We hunted them down, one by one, using the same techniques we just demonstrated on you." I finally found my voice. You're werewolves?" "Very good," Leo said with something that might have been approval. "Lycanthropes, to be more precise. We were all infected decades ago, learned to control our transformations, and eventually found each other. Formed a pack, but you were hunting. You said you were contractors hired to eliminate the predator." "We were hunting you, Derek," Vincent said from behind me. "You've been our primary surveillance asset for months. Every morning you'd run the trail, establishing patterns and proving the area was safe for other hikers. You were like a bird dog, flushing game for us to hunt." The full scope of what they were telling me began to sink in. The clothes I kept finding, the tracks, the arranged bones. "Trophies," Marcus confirmed. "And territorial markers. We wanted other predators to know this was claimed hunting ground. But we also wanted to attract curious humans who might investigate the mystery. People like you," Leo added. "Insurance investigator, trained to look for patterns and solve puzzles. We knew you'd eventually become obsessed with figuring out what was happening in these woods." I thought about all those mornings when I'd felt like I was being watched, all those times when the forest had gone unnaturally quiet around me. "You've been stalking me for months." "Studying you," Vincent corrected. "Learning your habits, your schedule, your psychological profile. We needed to understand how you thought before we could manipulate you into helping us." "Helping you do what?" "Clean up," Marcus said simply. The park closure was becoming a problem. Too much official attention, too many search teams, too much risk of discovery. We needed someone who could legitimately access the area and help us eliminate the evidence of our hunting activities. But I never helped you eliminate anything. You did exactly what we needed you to do, Leo explained. You provided cover for our continued presence in the area. Every time you illegally accessed the closed trail, you created reasonable doubt about who was responsible for any new evidence that might be discovered. Vincent completed the circle, leaving me surrounded by 3 werewolves in a remote location where my screams would never be heard. If investigators found fresh tracks or kill sites after the closure, he continued, we could always claim they were created by unauthorized hikers like you. People who ignored the warnings and put themselves at risk. But now the situation has changed, Marcus said. The trail is going to remain closed indefinitely, which means our hunting ground is no longer viable. Time to relocate to a new area. Which means, Leo added with what I was pretty sure was supposed to be a smile, we need to tie up loose ends. Can't have any witnesses who might be able to connect us to the missing hikers. I finally managed to get my legs moving and bolted toward the tree line. Behind me, I could hear laughter. Not human laughter, but something that might have been the werewolf equivalent of amusement. "Run, Derek," Marcus called after me. "Make it interesting." I crashed through the underbrush, following game trails and deer paths that I hoped would lead me back toward the main hiking trail. My only chance was to reach the trailhead in my car before the werewolves decided they were done playing with their food. But as I ran, I could hear them pacing me through the forest. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. Always just out of sight, but close enough to let me know they were there. They weren't trying to catch me yet. They were herding me, driving me toward whatever location they'd chosen for the kill. The realization made me change direction, abandoning the familiar trail system and striking out cross-country toward what I hoped was the ranger station. If I could reach official help, maybe I had a chance of survival. That's when I heard the howling again. Not behind me this time, but ahead, coming from the direction I was trying to flee. They'd gotten ahead of me somehow, cut off my escape route to the ranger station. I was trapped in a box canyon with 3 apex predators who had been planning this hunt for months. My only advantage was my familiarity with the terrain. I'd spent months exploring every ridge and creek bed in this area. If I could reach the old logging road where I'd been parking, there might be enough cell phone coverage to call for help. I doubled back toward the creek, using the sound of running water to mask my footsteps. The werewolves were still howling to each other, coordinating their positions, but they seemed to think I was still heading toward the ranger station. The creek led me downstream to the logging road, an old gravel track that connected to the highway about 2 miles from the official trailhead. My car was parked in a turnout where the road crossed the creek, hopefully still there and hopefully still functional. As I approached the creek crossing, I could see my Honda Civic exactly where I'd left it, keys still in my pocket, safety just 100 yards away. That's when Vincent stepped out of the trees directly in front of me. "Going somewhere, Derek?" he asked, still in his werewolf form but standing upright like a human. I spun around to find Marcus and Leo emerging from the forest behind me, completing the trap they'd been driving me toward all along. "Impressive," Marcus said. "You made it further than most. But this is the end of the line." "Why?" I asked, surprising myself by how steady my voice sounded. "Why not just let me go? I'll never tell anyone what I saw. I'll find a new place to hike. You'll never see me again, because you represent loose ends," Leo explained patiently, like he was talking to a child. "You know our faces, our names, our hunting patterns. You've seen us transform. That makes you a liability we can't afford to leave alive. Besides," Vincent added, "we're hungry. All this running around has worked up an appetite." They started closing in on me from 3 directions, moving with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. But as they approached, I heard something that gave me the first hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. Sirens. Multiple vehicles, coming up the logging road from the direction of the highway. The werewolves heard them too, their heads snapping toward the sound with obvious alarm. "Shit," Marcus snarled. "How did they find us so fast?" "The radio," I realized. "The radio you gave me was still transmitting. Everything you said, everything you confessed, it was being broadcast on an open channel." Vincent looked down at the radio clipped to my belt, his wolf features contorting with rage. "You clever little bastard." The sirens were getting closer, maybe half a mile away and closing fast. The werewolves had a choice: kill me quickly and try to escape, or abort the hunt and scatter before the authorities arrived. They chose escape. "This isn't over," Marcus promised as the 3 of them melted back into the forest. "We know where you live, where you work, what your daily routine looks like. Sooner or later, we'll finish what we started." Then they were gone, vanishing into the underbrush with the same silent efficiency they'd demonstrated all morning. The ranger vehicles arrived 5 minutes later. 2 patrol trucks and an ambulance, responding to what dispatch had logged as a possible hunter in distress call. The radio transmission had been picked up by a ranger station 20 miles away, but the details had been garbled enough that they weren't sure what kind of emergency they were responding to. I told them everything. The closed trail, the fake hunters, the transformation, the confession, the chase. I showed them my photos of the oversized tracks, described the arranged bones and territorial markers, gave them detailed descriptions of Marcus, Leo, and Vincent. The rangers searched the area for hours but found no trace of the 3 men. No abandoned campsite, no vehicle, no evidence they'd ever been there except for my testimony and the radio transmission that had saved my life. The official report listed the incident as a probable hoax perpetrated by an individual seeking attention following closure of recreational area. The werewolf angle was quietly dropped from all documentation, replaced with speculation that I'd encountered some kind of survivalist group engaged in illegal hunting activities. But the trail remained closed indefinitely, and additional rangers were assigned to patrol the area for signs of continued illegal access. I never hiked again. Not the Whispering Pines Trail, not any trail, not anywhere that wasn't clearly visible from a well-traveled road. The thought of being alone in the woods, even in broad daylight, was enough to trigger panic attacks that left me shaking and nauseous. My morning exercise routine shifted to a crowded gym downtown, surrounded by other people and security cameras and the constant possibility of help if something went wrong. It wasn't the same as running through peaceful forest trails, but it was safe in ways I'd never appreciated before. Dr. Chen noticed the change immediately. "You seem more anxious lately," she observed during our monthly check-in. "I thought the hiking was helping with your stress levels. Had a bad experience on the trail," I told her. Decided indoor exercise was a better fit for my lifestyle. She accepted that explanation, but I could see the concern in her eyes. My stress levels were climbing again. My sleep patterns were disrupted, and I was drinking more than I should to quiet the nightmares that woke me up several times each night. But I was alive, which was more than I could say for the 3 hikers who disappeared before the trail closure, or the others who might have vanished if I hadn't accidentally helped expose the pack that was using the Whispering Pines Trail as their hunting ground. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus kept his promise about finishing what they started, whether the 3 werewolves eventually tracked me down, learned my home address and work schedule, figured out a way to eliminate their loose end without leaving evidence that could be traced back to them. But it's been 2 years since that morning in the forest, and I'm still here, still alive, still working insurance claims, still trying to convince myself that what I experienced was real and not just some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The Whispering Pines Trail reopened 8 months ago, reclassified as safe for public use after extensive investigation found no evidence of dangerous wildlife activity. According to the Forest Service, whatever had been responsible for the missing hiker reports had either died or moved to a different territory. I drive past the trailhead sometimes on my way to other places, and I always see cars in the parking area, hikers loading backpacks, families with small children heading out for nature walks, elderly couples walking dogs on leashes, all of them trusting that the trail is safe, that whatever danger existed has been eliminated. Part of me wants to stop, to warn them about what might still be lurking in those woods. But what would I say? That 3 men can turn into werewolves and use hiking trails as hunting grounds? That the missing hiker reports were actually coordinated predation by creatures that understand human psychology well enough to manipulate it? Nobody would believe me. Hell, most days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But then I remember the radio transmission that saved my life, the confession that Marcus made while he thought no one was listening. Somewhere in a ranger station filing cabinet, there's an audio recording of 3 men admitting to multiple murders while describing supernatural abilities that shouldn't exist. That recording is the only proof I have that what happened to me was real. Everything else, the tracks, the arranged bones, the territorial markers, could be explained away as natural phenomena or fabricated evidence. So I keep driving past the trailhead without stopping, hoping that the werewolf pack really did relocate to a different hunting ground, hoping that the new hikers using the Whispering Pines Trail will never encounter anything more dangerous than poison ivy and twisted ankles. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself researching missing person reports from hiking areas across the state, looking for patterns that might indicate Marcus, Leo, and Vincent have found a new territory to hunt. The data is disturbing. Every month, several hikers disappear from various trail systems, most of them solo adventurers who were last seen heading into remote wilderness areas. The official explanations are always the same: falls, exposure, animal attacks, getting lost and dying of dehydration. But some of the details are eerily familiar. Torn clothing found arranged in unnatural patterns, oversized animal tracks near disappearance sites, reports of unusual howling coming from areas where no wolves are supposed to exist. And always, there are witnesses who claim they encountered friendly, knowledgeable hikers in the days before someone went missing. Experienced outdoorsmen who offered to share trail information, who seemed to know the terrain better than anyone, who had a particular interest in learning about other people's hiking schedules and favorite routes. I've started keeping my own database, cross-referencing missing person reports with witness descriptions and geographical patterns. It's probably just paranoia, the result of trauma and too many sleepless nights. But the data suggests that something is systematically hunting hikers across a multi-state area, using intelligence and coordination that goes far beyond normal predator behavior. 3 weeks ago, I found a report that made my hands shake while I read it. A family had disappeared while hiking in the Cascade Mountains, about 200 miles from the Whispering Pines Trail. Search teams found their campsite intact but abandoned, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. But nearby, investigators discovered what they described as animal bones arranged in ritualistic patterns and territorial markings consistent with large predators. The investigating ranger was quoted in the local newspaper. "We've never seen anything like this before. It's almost like something is deliberately marking this territory, warning other predators to stay away." I recognize that behavior. I've seen those territorial markers before. That night, I broke my own rule about staying away from wilderness areas. I drove to a 24-hour outdoor supply store and bought a high-powered rifle, silver-tipped ammunition, and enough camping gear to survive several days in the backcountry. Not because I'm planning to go hunting for werewolves, I'm not that crazy, but because I think they might come hunting for me, and I want to be prepared when they do. Marcus was right about one thing. They know where I live, where I work, what my daily routine looks like. If they've been monitoring missing hiker reports the same way I have, they know I've been tracking their activities across multiple states. That makes me a liability again, a loose end that needs to be tied up. The difference is that this time, I won't be caught unprepared in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. This time, I'll have weapons and backup plans and the advantage of knowing what they are. This time, if Marcus, Leo, and Vincent come for me, they're going to find out that insurance adjusters know a lot about risk assessment and contingency planning. And sometimes, the best way to manage a risk is to eliminate it completely. So I wait, and I watch, and I keep my rifle loaded with silver bullets that I really hope I'll never have to use, because some hunting grounds are too dangerous to reopen, no matter what the official reports say. Some predators are too intelligent to be deterred by simple trail closures. And sometimes, the only way to keep innocent people safe is to make sure that certain monsters never get the chance to hunt again. The Whispering Pines Trail might be officially open and deemed safe for public use, but every time I see families loading up their hiking gear and heading into those woods, I can't help wondering, are they the hunters or are they the prey? And if you're reading this while planning your own hiking adventures, ask yourself this question: do you really know who you're sharing the trail with? That friendly, knowledgeable hiker who seems so eager to learn about your route and schedule. Are they really trying to help you have a better outdoor experience? Or are they studying your patterns, learning your vulnerabilities, and deciding whether you'd make good prey for their next hunt? Think about that the next time you're alone on a remote trail, when the forest goes unnaturally quiet around you, when you catch a scent that smells like wet dog mixed with something sharper and more dangerous. Because sometimes, the most beautiful hiking trails are beautiful for a reason. Sometimes, they're preserved and protected not for their scenic value, but because they make perfect hunting grounds for predators who understand that humans are just another type of prey animal. Sweet dreams. And remember to check the moon phase before your next hiking trip. You never know who might be waiting for you on the trail. My new apartment's previous tenant left behind a locked room and a note that said, "Don't open during full moons." So naturally, I opened it on the first full moon. The steel door swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo through my bones, releasing a smell like wet dog and something darker. Something that made every primitive instinct in my brain scream at me to run. But I was already stepping across the threshold when I felt my spine begin to crack and reshape, and I realized that some warnings aren't meant to protect what's inside from getting out. They're meant to protect you from discovering what you really are. Let me back up to 3 weeks ago, when I was just Alex Morrison, 22-year-old college graduate with a journalism degree and about 37 cents in my checking account, desperately searching for affordable housing in a city where affordable and habitable seemed to be mutually exclusive concepts. I'd been living in my car for 2 weeks, showering at the gym and surviving on gas station, coffee, and whatever free food I could scavenge from job interviews. The position at Metro Tribune paid decent money, assuming I could survive long enough to receive my first paycheck. Finding an apartment within my budget that didn't require first month, last month, security deposit, and a blood sacrifice had proven nearly impossible. That's when I saw the Craigslist ad for the Meridian Arms building. Furnished studio apartment, move-in ready, first month free for qualified tenant. Must be comfortable with eccentric neighbors and occasional odd sounds. No questions asked about personal habits or nocturnal activities. The rent was suspiciously low for the neighborhood, and the no questions asked part should have been a red flag. But when you've been sleeping in a Honda Civic for 2 weeks, red flags start looking like welcome mats. The building itself was a converted warehouse in the Arts District. 6 stories of industrial architecture that had been renovated into loft apartments sometime in the 1980s. It had the kind of character that real estate agents call charming, and normal people call probably haunted. Mrs. Chen, the property manager, was a tiny elderly woman who looked like she could bench press a refrigerator. She met me in the lobby, which featured exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, and the lingering scent of something I couldn't quite identify. Something wild and musky that reminded me of visits to the zoo as a kid. "You're here about apartment 4B?" she asked, looking me up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock auctions. "That's right, Alex Morrison. I called about an hour ago." She nodded and pulled out an enormous ring of keys that looked like it could open every door in the city. "Follow me. And don't stare at the other tenants if you encounter them. They value their privacy." The elevator was an ancient freight lift that groaned and wheezed its way to the 4th floor. As we rose past each level, I caught glimpses of the building's residents through partially open doors, glimpses that left me with more questions than answers. A pale woman in a flowing dress who seemed to glide rather than walk. A massive man with shoulder-length hair who was gnawing on what looked like a raw steak. A teenager whose eyes reflected the hallway lights like an animal's. Interesting neighbors. I commented. Mrs. Chen didn't respond, which was probably an answer in itself. Apartment 4B was at the end of a long hallway lined with doors that had multiple locks and what looked like scratch marks around the frames. The apartment itself was larger than I'd expected. An open loft space with high ceilings, exposed beams, and windows that faced west toward the setting sun. Furniture comes with the lease, Mrs. Chen explained, gesturing toward a leather couch, a bed that was basically a mattress on the floor, and a kitchenette that looked like it had been designed for someone who didn't cook much. Previous tenant left everything behind when he moved. Moved where? Elsewhere. You ask a lot of questions for someone who answered an ad that specifically mentioned no questions asked. She had a point. I walked around the space, noting details that would have been concerning if I hadn't been so desperate for shelter. Scratches on the hardwood floors, like something with claws had been pacing back and forth. Windows that had been fitted with heavy-duty locks from the inside. A lingering smell similar to what I detected in the lobby, but stronger. What happened to the previous tenant? I asked. Mrs. Chen fixed me with a stare that could have frozen coffee. He found a living situation that better suited his needs. Are you interested in the apartment or not? The honest answer was that everything about this place felt wrong. The building, the neighbors, the apartment itself, all of it screamed that I should walk away and keep sleeping in my car until I found something normal. But normal apartments required credit checks and references and deposits I couldn't afford. This place was offering immediate occupancy, furnished, first month free, no questions asked. Sometimes you have to choose between comfortable and available. I'll take it, I said. Mrs. Chen nodded like she'd expected that answer. She pulled out a lease agreement that was surprisingly simple. Just 2 pages of standard rental language with a few unusual clauses about respecting other tenants' privacy and not disturbing the building's natural rhythms. Sign here, here, and initial there, she instructed. First month is free, but rent is due on the first of every month after that. No exceptions. No excuses. Pay on time or find somewhere else to live. I signed the papers, received a set of keys, and officially became a resident of the Meridian Arms building. Mrs. Chen was halfway out the door when she paused and turned back. One more thing, she said, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Previous tenant left this for whoever moved in next. Said it was important. She handed me the note and left without another word, leaving me alone in my new apartment with a piece of paper that would change everything. The note was written in neat, precise handwriting on expensive stationery. To whoever lives here next, there's a locked room behind the false wall in the bedroom area. Steel door, reinforced frame, multiple locks. I've left the keys in the kitchen drawer next to the sink. Do not open this room during full moons. I cannot stress this enough. The door is locked for everyone's protection, including your own. If you must satisfy your curiosity, do it during new moon periods when the influence is weakest. But honestly, some doors are better left closed. The other tenants will understand if you ask them about it, but they won't volunteer information unless you specifically request it. Mrs. Chen knows the full situation. Be careful. Be smart. Be safe. Marcus Delacroix. I read the note 3 times, then immediately started looking for the false wall it mentioned. I found it behind the bed. A section of drywall that looked slightly different from the rest, with hairline cracks that suggested it was designed to be moved. A little pressure in the right spots caused a panel to swing inward, revealing a narrow hallway that led to what was obviously the locked room. The door was exactly as described. Heavy steel painted flat black, with 3 separate deadbolts and a frame that looked like it belonged in a bank vault. There were scratch marks around the locks and deep gouges in the metal itself, like something with incredible strength had tried to claw its way out. Standing in that narrow hallway, I could smell the same wild, musky scent I'd been detecting throughout the building, but concentrated and intense enough to make my eyes water. Whatever had been kept in this room, it wasn't human. I went back to the kitchen and found the keys exactly where the note said they'd be. 3 heavy brass keys on a ring, along with a smaller note that simply said, "New moon only. Trust me." The rational part of my brain understood that I should respect Marcus Delacroix's warning. He'd clearly put a lot of thought into that message, and the multiple locks suggested something genuinely dangerous was behind that door. But I was a journalism major. My entire academic career had been built around asking questions, investigating mysteries, and refusing to accept "because I said so" as a reasonable explanation for anything. A locked room with a cryptic warning was like catnip to someone with my professional inclinations. I spent my first week in the apartment trying to resist the temptation to open that door. I unpacked my belongings, started my new job at the Tribune, and attempted to establish some kind of normal routine. But every night, I found myself standing in that narrow hallway, holding the keys and staring at the steel door. The curiosity was becoming obsessive. I'd lie in bed thinking about what could be hidden behind all that metal and security. My new job provided a welcome distraction during the day. The Metro Tribune was a small but respected newspaper that covered local politics, community events, and the kind of investigative pieces that the bigger papers didn't have time for. My editor, Sarah Kellerman, was a veteran journalist who'd worked for major dailies before deciding she preferred the pace and focus of smaller operations. "You've got good instincts," she told me after I'd filed my first few stories. "But you need to learn when to dig deeper and when to leave things alone. Not every mystery needs to be solved." How if only I'd listened to that advice. The building's other residents were unusual. Not unfriendly exactly, but careful in ways that suggested they were all hiding something significant. I'd encounter them in the hallway or elevator, exchange polite nods and brief small talk, but never anything approaching real conversation. The pale woman from the second floor turned out to be named Elena. She worked nights at what she described as freelance consulting and never seemed to be awake during daylight hours. Her apartment faced east, but she'd covered all the windows with blackout curtains thick enough to block nuclear radiation. The large man with long hair was David from 3A. He worked at a butcher shop and always smelled like raw meat and something wilder. He'd nod politely when we crossed paths, but his eyes had an intensity that made me uncomfortable, like he was evaluating me for something. The teenager turned out to be named Riley, though I wasn't sure if that was male or female. They lived with someone they called their mentor in apartment 5C, and I only ever saw them during dawn or dusk hours. Riley's eyes really did reflect light like an animal's, which I'd initially assumed was some kind of cosmetic contact lenses. All of them seemed to know about the locked room in my apartment. Not explicitly. No one ever mentioned it directly, but they'd ask how I was settling in with a tone that suggested they were really asking about something else. And they all seemed to be waiting for something, watching me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Chen was the most direct. "You found Marcus's message?" she asked when I ran into her in the lobby during my second week. "I found a note, if that's what you mean, and I'm still thinking about it." She nodded gravely. "Thinking is good. Acting without thinking is how people get hurt." "What was in that room, Mrs. Chen?" "That's not my story to tell. But Marcus left those instructions for good reasons. Where is Marcus now?" "Somewhere safer," she said, and walked away before I could ask any follow-up questions. By the end of my second week, I convinced myself that the locked room probably contained something perfectly mundane. Maybe Marcus had been growing marijuana and was paranoid about discovery. Maybe it was filled with stolen property or illegal weapons. Maybe he'd been running some kind of internet scam and didn't want evidence discovered. The "don't open during full moons" instruction was probably just Marcus being dramatic. Or maybe he'd been mentally unstable and genuinely believed in supernatural nonsense. That's what I told myself anyway. The full moon was scheduled for Saturday night. I'd been checking moon phase calendars obsessively, telling myself I was just being scientifically thorough. New moon would be in 2 weeks, which seemed like an arbitrary amount of time to wait for satisfying my curiosity. Friday evening, I made my decision. I was going to open that door on Saturday night, full moon or no full moon, and finally put this mystery to rest. I should have paid more attention to how the other building residents were behaving. Elena had disappeared completely. I hadn't seen her for 3 days, and no lights came on in her apartment even during the early evening hours when she was usually active. David had started avoiding the elevator, taking the stairs with quick, nervous movements that seemed completely out of character for someone his size. Riley had been pacing the hallways at odd hours, moving with restless energy that made me think of caged animals. Mrs. Chen had stopped her usual building rounds, and I'd caught glimpses of her installing additional locks on several apartment doors. But I was too focused on the locked room to recognize these behaviors as preparation for something that happened every month. Saturday evening, I ate dinner, watched television, and waited for what felt like an appropriate time to conduct my investigation. The building was unusually quiet. No footsteps in the hallway, no television sounds from neighboring apartments, no urban noise filtering up from the street. It was like everyone except me had evacuated. Around 10 p.m., I gathered my courage, grabbed the keys, and walked into the narrow hallway that led to the steel door. My hands were shaking as I inserted the first key, then the second, then the third. The locks opened with solid mechanical clicks that seemed to echo through the entire building. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The room was larger than I'd expected. Maybe 12 feet by 15, with concrete walls and no windows. But it had clearly been designed as some kind of containment space. Heavy-duty eye bolts were set into the walls and floor, with chains and restraints that looked like they'd been designed to hold something incredibly strong. The walls were covered with scratch marks. Not random damage, but systematic gouging that formed patterns and symbols I didn't recognize. Some of the scratches were deep enough that I could fit my fingers into them, but the most disturbing feature was the floor. The concrete was stained with what looked like old blood stains, and there were bite marks in the metal restraints that suggested something with very large teeth had been chewing on them. In the corner was a journal, bound in leather and filled with handwriting I recognized from the note Marcus had left. I opened the journal and began reading. Day 1. First transformation complete. The room held, but barely. Need to reinforce the restraints and add additional anchoring points. The entity that I become during full moons is stronger and more cunning than I anticipated. Day 32. Second transformation. Added silver core chains, which seemed to cause discomfort to the transformed state. Entity spent most of the night trying to escape rather than attempting to harm itself. Progress. Day 63. Met another resident who shares my condition. Elena from 2B. She's been managing her transformations for years, has developed techniques for retaining human consciousness during the change. She's agreed to help me improve my containment setup. The journal went on for months, documenting Marcus's gradual understanding and acceptance of what he'd become. The early entries were filled with terror and self-loathing, but they gradually evolved into something approaching scientific curiosity about his condition. As I sat there reading about werewolf transformations and supernatural community support groups, my rational mind simply refused to process what I was learning. Werewolves weren't real. They were folklore, movie monsters, Halloween costumes. Marcus Delacroix had obviously been suffering from some kind of mental illness that made him believe he was turning into a wolf during full moons. But as I sat there in what was clearly a containment chamber designed to hold something incredibly strong and violent, alternative explanations became harder to maintain. That's when I noticed the smell was getting stronger. The wild, musky scent that I'd been detecting throughout the building was now overwhelming, like being locked in a kennel with a dozen wet dogs. But there was something else underneath it, something metallic and sharp that made my nostrils burn, and I was starting to feel strange. My joints were beginning to ache in ways I'd never experienced before. My skin felt tight and hot, like I was running a fever. Most disturbing of all, my senses seemed to be sharpening. I could hear individual conversations from apartments 3 floors away, could smell what people had eaten for dinner, could see details in the dimly lit room that should have been invisible. I tried to stand up and leave the room, but my legs wouldn't support my weight properly. It felt like my bones were shifting, changing shape in ways that made normal movement impossible. That's when I looked down and saw that my hands were changing. My fingers were getting longer, my nails were extending into claws, and dark hair was spreading up my arms like I was watching time-lapse footage of plant growth. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out was something between a human voice and an animal howl. Marcus hadn't been mentally ill. The journal entries weren't the product of delusion or fantasy. He really had been transforming into something else during full moons, and by opening his containment room during the full moon, I'd somehow triggered the same condition in myself. The transformation was unlike anything I could have imagined. It wasn't the dramatic Hollywood version with special effects and dramatic music. It was organic and inevitable, like watching a flower bloom or a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis. My spine elongated, forcing me onto all fours. My jaw pushed forward into a muzzle filled with teeth that were designed for tearing meat. My legs reshaped themselves for quadrupedal locomotion, and my entire body mass seemed to increase as muscle and bone density changed to accommodate my new form. But the strangest part was that I remained conscious throughout the entire process. I could feel every change, understand what was happening to me, even make decisions about how to respond to my new capabilities. I was still Alex Morrison, but I was also something else now. Something with the instincts of a large predator and the physical capabilities to act on those instincts. Standing in Marcus's containment room in my new werewolf form, I finally understood why he'd left that warning. The room wasn't designed to protect other people from whatever was inside. It was designed to protect the werewolf from making choices they'd regret when they changed back to human form. Without the restraints and barriers that Marcus had installed, I was free to explore my new abilities, free to hunt, free to feed on whatever prey I could find. And in a building full of people, prey was readily available. I padded out of the containment room and through my apartment, my enhanced senses picking up dozens of individual human scents from throughout the building. My predator instincts cataloged each one, which smelled weak and vulnerable, which might provide the most satisfying hunt, which would be easiest to take down without a prolonged struggle. But as I approached the apartment door, planning to explore the hallways and select my first victim, I heard something that stopped me cold. Howling. Multiple voices, coming from different parts of the building. Other werewolves. Other residents who were going through their own monthly transformations. I wasn't alone in this condition, and I wasn't the only predator in the building. The howling was answered by scratching sounds from behind apartment doors. Other werewolves who were safely contained in their own version of Marcus's room, but who were responding to my presence in the hallways. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Human footsteps, moving with purpose toward the 4th floor. I retreated back into my apartment just as Mrs. Chen appeared in the hallway. She was carrying what looked like a tranquilizer gun and wearing protective gear that covered her from head to toe. "Alex," she called softly. "I know you're in there, and I know what's happened. This is normal. It's manageable. But you need to listen to me very carefully." I tried to respond, but my vocal cords could only produce growls and whines. "The first transformation is always the most dangerous," Mrs. Chen continued, apparently understanding my nonverbal communication. "You're confused, probably scared, definitely experiencing predatory instincts that feel overwhelming. That's normal." She approached my door slowly, keeping her tranquilizer gun ready but not pointed directly at me. Marcus's room was designed to help people like you get through the first few transformations safely. By opening it during the full moon, you absorbed residual energy. that triggered your own lycanthropic condition. It's rare, but not unheard of. Through my enhanced senses, I could detect other people moving through the building, human scents, but with that same wild undertone that I was learning to associate with lycanthropes who weren't currently transformed. The other residents are coming to help, Mrs. Chen explained. Elena, David, Riley. They've all been through first transformations. They know how to guide you through this safely. Elena appeared at the end of the hallway, moving with inhuman grace despite maintaining human form. She was carrying restraints similar to what I'd seen in Marcus's room. "Hello, Alex," she said in a voice that carried easily despite being barely above a whisper. "I know this is frightening, but you're going to be fine. We're all here to help you." David emerged from the stairwell, carrying what looked like medical supplies. Riley appeared from the opposite direction, their eyes reflecting the hallway lights with that animal gleam I'd noticed before. "This building is specifically designed as housing for lycanthropes, Mrs. Chen continued. We're a community, a support system for people learning to manage supernatural conditions that the outside world wouldn't understand. The first thing you need to understand," Elena added, stepping closer to my apartment door, "is that you're not a monster. You're not evil. You're just different now. And with training and support, you can learn to control the transformations instead of being controlled by them." Riley spoke up for the first time, their voice carrying an odd harmonic that made my werewolf ears prick up with attention. "The predatory instincts feel overwhelming right now, but they'll become manageable with practice. You can learn to transform at will, retain human consciousness during the change, even suppress the transformations entirely if that's what you prefer. But first," David said, "we need to get you safely restrained until the full moon passes. The initial transformation lasts until dawn, and you need to experience it in a controlled environment." I wanted to resist, to assert my independence and figure things out on my own. But looking at these people, these fellow lycanthropes who'd successfully integrated their supernatural condition into normal lives, I realized I had a choice to make. I could try to handle this alone, probably make dangerous mistakes, possibly hurt innocent people while learning to control abilities I didn't understand. Or I could trust this community that had apparently been built specifically to help people in my situation. I stepped back from my apartment door and lay down in a submissive posture, indicating that I was willing to accept their help. Mrs. Chen smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her since moving into the building. "Smart choice," she said, pulling out a key that opened my apartment from the outside. "Most people try to fight it the first time. Makes everything more difficult." Elena, David, and Riley entered my apartment with the calm efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. They guided me back to Marcus's containment room, which they quickly converted into a comfortable space for riding out the rest of my transformation. "The change will reverse automatically at dawn," Mrs. Chen explained as they finished setting up. "When you transform back to human form, you'll retain full memory of tonight's experiences. That's important. Integration requires understanding both sides of your nature. Tomorrow evening, we'll introduce you to the broader community," David added. "There are lycanthropes throughout the city, all learning to balance supernatural abilities with normal human lives." As they prepared to leave me alone to work through the rest of my first transformation, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Hours earlier, I'd been a normal human being. Now I was a werewolf, but instead of facing this crisis alone, I'd found a community of people who understood exactly what I was going through. When dawn arrived and I transformed back to human form, I understood that I'd been given something precious, a choice about how to live with my new nature, and people who would help me make that choice work. The locked room had become my gateway to a community I never knew existed. The warning I'd ignored had led me to exactly where I needed to be. Some doors are locked to protect what's inside. Others are locked until you're ready to discover what's been waiting for you. The choice, as Marcus had learned and I was now learning, was always yours to make. 6 months later, I was fully integrated into both human and lycanthrope society. The room that had once been Marcus's prison had become my sanctuary, a place where I could safely explore aspects of my nature that required privacy and understanding. And when the next curious tenant inevitably found themselves drawn to that steel door, I'd be ready to help them make the same choice I'd made, to embrace what they were becoming, rather than fight against it. Because some transformations aren't curses. They're opportunities to become more than you ever imagined possible. My new job as a night security guard seemed perfect until I realized I was the only one who couldn't smell what was really happening in this building after dark. The other guards kept asking if I'd noticed any unusual scents during my rounds, and I kept telling them the worst thing I smelled was Linda from accounting's leftover fish lunch. Until the night I walked in on the entire marketing department mid-transformation and understood why they'd hired the one guy with no sense of smell. Let me back up to 6 months ago, when I was Sam Parker, 28-year-old college dropout with a patchy work history and an unemployment check that had just run out. I'd been job hunting for 8 months, getting rejected for everything from retail positions to data entry work. Apparently, some college and willing to learn don't carry as much weight on a resume as I'd hoped. The security guard position at Meridian Corporate Plaza seemed too good to be true. Decent hourly wage, full benefits after 90 days, and they were hiring immediately with minimal background checks. The job posting was vague about specific duties, just overnight security monitoring, and must be comfortable working alone. I should have wondered why they were so desperate to fill the position. The interview was conducted by Janet Wu, head of human resources, and Frank Rodriguez, the day shift security supervisor. They met me in the lobby of a gleaming 30-story office building in the financial district, the kind of place where people wear expensive suits and carry briefcases that cost more than my car. "So Sam," Janet said, reviewing my application, "tell us about your experience with overnight work. I've done some third-shift warehouse jobs, restaurant closing shifts, that kind of thing. I'm naturally a night owl, so staying awake isn't a problem." Frank leaned forward with interest. "How's your sense of smell?" It was such a random question that I thought I'd misheard him. "Excuse me?" "Your sense of smell," he repeated. "Some people are really sensitive to odors, especially in closed office buildings. HVAC systems can circulate all kinds of scents. Actually pretty terrible. I've had chronic sinus problems since I was a kid. Can barely smell anything unless it's really strong." Janet and Frank exchanged a look that seemed oddly pleased. "That's actually perfect for this position," Janet said. "Some of our tenants work with materials that produce strong odors. Having a guard who isn't bothered by smells would be ideal." The rest of the interview was surprisingly brief. They asked about my availability, my comfort level with being alone for long periods, and whether I had any problems with employee privacy during after-hours work periods. "Some of our tenants have unconventional work schedules," Frank explained. "They might be in the building during your shift, but they prefer not to be disturbed unless there's an actual emergency." "No problem," I said. "I'm good at minding my own business." "Excellent," Janet smiled. "When can you start?" I was hired on the spot and scheduled for training the following Monday. As I walked out of the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been more interested in my sinus problems than my qualifications, but I'd been unemployed too long to question good fortune. Training was conducted by the outgoing night guard, a nervous guy named Pete who seemed eager to move on to day shift work. "Look," he said as we sat in the security office on the ground floor, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. "This is mostly an easy job. Make your rounds every 2 hours, check that doors are locked, respond to any alarms. But there are some quirks you need to know about." What kind of quirks?" Pete pulled out a 3-ring binder thick with policies and procedures. "First thing, Floors 15 through 25 are occupied by Lunar Dynamics Corporation. They do some kind of biological research, work weird hours, especially around certain times of the month. You might see employees there all night, but don't bother them unless they specifically ask for help. Biological research? Something to do with genetic therapy. Point is, they're harmless, but they value their privacy. Second thing, elevator access to floors 26 through 30 is restricted during your shift. Those floors are undergoing structural modifications and aren't safe for security patrols. He flipped through several pages of the manual. Third thing, and this is important, if you hear unusual sounds during your rounds, voices, movement, that kind of thing, just log it in your report as routine tenant activity. Don't investigate unless someone specifically calls down asking for assistance. Unusual sounds. Like what? Pete hesitated. Just sounds. Look, Sam, this job is going to seem weird at first, but it pays well, the hours are regular, and as long as you follow the policies, nobody bothers you. Don't overthink it. He spent the next hour walking me through the building layout, showing me which doors to check, where the emergency equipment was stored, and how to use the communication system to contact building management if needed. The building itself was impressive. 30 floors of modern office space with high-end finishes, advanced security systems, and views of the city that probably cost tenants a fortune, but there were odd details that didn't quite make sense. Many of the interior doors had been reinforced with steel plates and additional locks. Several conference rooms had been modified with what looked like soundproofing materials, and there were scratch marks on walls and door frames throughout the building. Not damage exactly, but wear patterns that suggested heavy, regular use by something with claws. What happened to the guy I'm replacing? I asked as we completed our tour. Marcus? He got promoted to day shift. Said he preferred working when there were more people around. Any particular reason? Pete looked uncomfortable. Marcus was sensitive to smells. Said the building had odors during night shifts that bothered his allergies. Since you mentioned you can't smell much, that shouldn't be a problem for you. My first week on the job was exactly as advertised. Quiet, routine, and slightly boring. I'd arrive at 11 p.m., receive a brief update from the evening security guard, then spend the night making rounds and monitoring camera feeds while listening to podcasts. The building was never completely empty. There were always a few cars in the parking garage, and the cameras would occasionally show people moving through the upper floors, but whoever was working late kept to themselves, and I never encountered anyone during my patrol rounds. The only unusual thing was how frequently the elevators seemed to run during the night. I'd hear the dings and mechanical sounds of the cars moving between floors, but when I checked the camera feeds, the elevator lobbies always appeared empty. Probably just automated systems, I told myself. Building management testing equipment or something. By my second week, I developed a comfortable routine. First round at midnight, second round at 2 a.m., third round at 4 a.m., final round at 6 a.m. before the day shift arrived. In between, I'd sit in the security office, watch the monitors, and work on online courses that might eventually help me find a better career. That's when I started noticing the patterns. The mysterious late-night activity wasn't random. It followed a schedule. Certain floors would be active on specific nights, with employees arriving in groups and staying until dawn. The activity was most intense during the third week of each month, with the heaviest concentration of people working overnight during the 3 days around the full moon. I mentioned this to Frank during one of our weekly check-ins. Yeah. Some of our tenants have project deadlines that follow monthly cycles, he said without much interest. Pharmaceutical research, financial reporting, that kind of thing. As long as they're not causing problems, it's not really our concern. But I was starting to get curious about what kind of work required entire departments to stay overnight during specific moon phases. During my Thursday night shift in my third week, I decided to do a more thorough investigation of the floors that showed the most activity. Floors 15 through 20 were home to Lunar Dynamics Corporation, the biological research company Pete had mentioned. According to the building directory, they occupied about half the office space and employed roughly 200 people. The lobby area looked normal enough, standard corporate setup with a reception desk, comfortable seating, and motivational posters about embracing your natural potential and transformation through innovation. But as I moved deeper into their office space, I started noticing modifications that seemed unusual for a typical research facility. Several of the office doors had been fitted with heavy-duty deadbolt locks. Not just privacy locks, but the kind of security hardware you'd see on bank vaults. Conference rooms had been soundproofed with industrial-grade materials, and the windows had been covered with what looked like reinforced steel shutters. Most unusual were the relaxation rooms I found scattered throughout the floor. These were large, empty spaces with concrete floors, no furniture, and drainage systems built into the center of each room. The walls were reinforced with steel plating and covered with what looked like protective padding. I was examining one of these rooms when I heard voices approaching from the main corridor. Should be starting any minute now. Is everyone here? Marketing team is already set up in conference room C. Engineering is using the north relaxation space. What about the new guy? Peterson from IT? First time. We've got him set up in the small room with Sarah as his mentor. I quickly stepped back into a supply closet and listened as what sounded like a dozen people moved past my hiding spot. They were talking in the casual, professional tones of coworkers discussing a routine business meeting, but their conversation didn't make sense for 2 a.m. on a Thursday night. After the voices faded, I carefully made my way back toward the elevator, planning to return to the security office and pretend I hadn't seen anything unusual. But as I passed one of the modified conference rooms, I heard sounds that made me stop dead in my tracks. It started as normal human conversation, people discussing work projects and weekend plans. But gradually, the voices began to change. They became deeper, more guttural, with occasional sounds that weren't human at all. Then, I heard what was unmistakably a howl. Long, mournful, and definitely coming from inside the conference room. The howl was answered by several others, and within minutes the entire floor was filled with sounds that belonged in a nature documentary about wolves, not a corporate office building. I stood frozen in the hallway, trying to process what I was hearing. Either Lunar Dynamics was conducting some kind of animal research that involved live wolves, or their biological research was something much stranger than I'd imagined. That's when I caught the scent. For someone who supposedly couldn't smell anything, I was suddenly overwhelmed by an odor that was impossible to ignore. It was wild and musky, like wet dog fur mixed with something sharper and more primal. It was the smell of predators, multiple large predators, all in the same enclosed space. The smell was coming from every direction, not just from the conference room where I'd heard the howling, but from throughout the entire floor. Whatever was happening in this building, it was happening on a much larger scale than I'd realized. I made it back to the elevator and down to the security office without encountering anyone, but I spent the rest of my shift trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The logical explanations all fell apart under scrutiny. No legitimate research facility would house live wolves in a downtown office building, and no amount of HVAC problems would produce the smells I'd detected. By Friday morning, I'd convinced myself that I'd imagined most of what had happened. Stress, lack of sleep, and too much caffeine had probably combined to create hallucinations that seemed real at the time. But when Frank arrived for the day shift, he took one look at me and frowned. "You okay, Sam? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," I said. "Long night." "Yeah. Thursdays can be rough. Full moon cycle always gets people worked up." He paused, studying my expression. "You didn't run into any of the Lunar Dynamics folks during your rounds, did you?" The way he asked the question suggested that running into them would be a problem. No, I lied. Quiet night. Just the usual elevator sounds and some voices from the upper floors. Frank nodded with obvious relief. Good. They're good tenants, but they're very particular about their privacy during project periods. Better to give them space to work. I went home and spent the weekend researching Lunar Dynamics Corporation online. Their website was professionally designed but vague about their actual business activities. They claimed to specialize in genetic therapy solutions and human potential optimization, with client testimonials about life-changing transformations and discovering your true nature. The company had been founded 15 years ago by Dr. Elena Vasquez, who held advanced degrees in both biochemistry and psychology. Her biography mentioned extensive research into inherited genetic variations and environmental triggers for dormant genetic expression. None of it sounded like the kind of research that would require employees to work overnight during full moon periods, but it was technical enough that I couldn't rule out legitimate scientific explanations for what I'd witnessed. Monday night, I returned to work determined to stick to my assigned duties and avoid any further investigations of tenant activities. But as I settled into the security office for what I hoped would be a routine shift, Frank pulled me aside. "Sam, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. During your rounds last week, did you notice any unusual odors?" The question caught me off guard. "You mean like chemical smells? From the research labs? Any kind of unusual smells? Strong, distinctive odors that seemed out of place in an office building?" I thought about the overwhelming scent I detected on Thursday night, the wild, predatory smell that had been impossible to ignore. But admitting I'd smelled something would mean admitting I'd been investigating areas I was supposed to avoid. "Not really," I said. "I mean, my sense of smell isn't great to begin with." Frank studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, just, if you do notice anything unusual, strong odors or strange sounds or anything that seems out of the ordinary, make sure you document it in your security log. Building management needs to know about any environmental issues that might affect tenant health and safety." After Frank left, I spent the first few hours of my shift reviewing the security manual more carefully. I'd skimmed through it during training, but now I was looking for details that might explain what was really happening in the building. Buried in the appendices was a section on special accommodations for research tenants that I'd overlooked before. It outlined policies for tenants who worked with sensitive biological materials that required controlled environmental conditions during specific time periods. The language was bureaucratic and vague, but it seemed to give certain tenants permission to modify their office spaces, restrict access during critical research periods, and conduct activities that might produce atypical sounds or odors. There was also a section about emergency protocols for containment situations that suggested some tenant activities posed risks that went beyond typical office building concerns. Security guards were instructed to immediately contact building management rather than emergency services if they encountered biological containment breaches or uncontrolled research subjects. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Lunar Dynamics Corporation wasn't conducting normal biological research. But I couldn't figure out what they were actually doing, and my employment contract included strict confidentiality clauses that prohibited me from discussing tenant activities with anyone outside the building management. Tuesday night passed without incident, but Wednesday brought a development that changed everything. I was making my midnight rounds when the elevator stopped at the 18th floor without me pressing any buttons. The doors opened to reveal Dr. Elena Vasquez, the founder of Lunar Dynamics Corporation, waiting in the corridor. She was a striking woman in her 40s, with silver-streaked hair and intense dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance. She was dressed in business, casual clothing, but something about her posture and movements reminded me of a large predator. Graceful, confident, and potentially dangerous. "You must be Sam," she said, stepping into the elevator with me. "I'm Dr. Vasquez. I've been hoping to meet our new security guard." "Dr. Vasquez, nice to meet you. I hope my rounds haven't been disturbing your work." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not at all. In fact, I wanted to thank you for being so respectful of our privacy. Many security guards feel compelled to investigate every sound and smell they encounter. Your restraint has been appreciated. The elevator continued its descent, but Dr. Vasquez made no move to press a button for her destination floor. I understand you have an unusual medical condition, she continued conversationally. Chronic sinus problems that affect your sense of smell? That's right. Has been an issue since childhood. Fascinating. And you've never sought treatment? Surgery? Medications? Alternative therapies? The question seemed oddly personal for a casual conversation with a tenant, but I didn't want to be rude. I've seen a few doctors over the years. They all said it was just structural. Deviated septum, narrow nasal passages, that kind of thing. Not really fixable without major surgery. Dr. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. Have you ever considered that your condition might not be medical, that it might be evolutionary? Evolutionary? Some humans have genetic variations that affect sensory perception. What appears to be a disability might actually be an adaptation, a way of filtering out information that could be overwhelming or disturbing to someone with your particular neural architecture. The elevator reached the ground floor, but neither of us moved to exit. Dr. Vasquez, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting. I'm suggesting that your inability to detect certain scents might be protecting you from knowledge that your conscious mind isn't ready to process. But that protection comes at a cost. It limits your ability to fully understand your environment and the people around you. She pulled out a business card and handed it to me. If you're ever interested in exploring treatment options, I'd be happy to discuss some experimental therapies we're developing, genetic treatments that can unlock dormant sensory capabilities. That's generous of you, but I've learned to live with the condition, of course. But the offer stands. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen when we stop accepting limitations and start embracing our full potential. The elevator doors opened, and Dr. Vasquez stepped out into the lobby with that same predatory grace I'd noticed earlier. Enjoy the rest of your shift, Sam. And remember, if you ever notice anything unusual during your rounds, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. She walked away, leaving me alone in the elevator with her business card and a dozen new questions about what was really happening in this building. Thursday night was the full moon, and I arrived at work prepared for another round of mysterious late-night activity. But this time, I was determined to get answers. I started my shift normally, checking in with the evening guard and settling into the security office to monitor camera feeds. But instead of waiting until midnight for my first round, I decided to begin investigating as soon as the building was officially closed to normal business hours. The first unusual activity started around 9 p.m., before my shift even officially began. Cars began arriving in the parking garage. Not the usual trickle of employees working late, but a steady stream of people who seemed to be arriving for some kind of organized event. By 10 p.m., the 18th and 19th floors were showing more activity than I'd ever seen during normal business hours. The camera feed showed dozens of people moving through the Lunar Dynamics office space, but they all seemed to be heading toward areas that weren't covered by security cameras. At 11 p.m., as the day shift security guard was preparing to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The people entering the building weren't dressed like typical office workers. They were wearing casual clothes, jeans, t-shirts, athletic wear, and many of them were carrying what looked like overnight bags, like they were planning to stay the night. But it was their behavior that really caught my attention. They moved through the lobby and elevators with a restless energy that reminded me of caged animals. Several of them kept sniffing the air, like they were tracking scents that I couldn't detect, and when they looked at the security cameras, their eyes seemed to reflect the light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. By midnight, the building was filled with sounds that definitely weren't coming from normal office work. I could hear voices, movement, and periodic howling that echoed through the ventilation system from multiple floors. This time, I wasn't going to hide in a supply closet. I was going to find out exactly what Lunar Dynamics Corporation was doing in this building. I started with the 18th floor, where most of the activity seemed to be concentrated. The elevator opened to reveal a scene that my rational mind simply couldn't process. The normal office furniture had been moved aside to create large, open spaces. The fluorescent lighting had been replaced with dimmer, warmer illumination that created a more natural atmosphere. And scattered throughout the floor were dozens of people in various stages of undress, moving with fluid, animal-like grace. But they weren't entirely people anymore. Some of them were in the middle of transformations that I'd only seen in horror movies. Bodies changing shape, faces elongating into muzzles, limbs reshaping for quadrupedal movement. Others had completed the change and were padding around the office space in full werewolf form, interacting with the partially transformed individuals with obvious familiarity and affection. It was like stumbling into the world's strangest corporate team-building event, except the team was composed entirely of werewolves. I stood frozen in the elevator doorway, watching dozens of supernatural beings conduct what appeared to be a perfectly normal social gathering. They were talking, laughing, sharing food, and generally behaving like co-workers at an office party, except they were werewolves. In a downtown office building, on a Thursday night, that's when Dr. Vasquez noticed me. She was in partial transformation, still recognizably human, but with elongated features and eyes that glowed with reflected light. When she saw me standing in the elevator, she smiled and began walking in my direction. "Sam," she said in a voice that was deeper and more resonant than before. "I was wondering when you'd finally decide to investigate." Behind her, the other werewolves had stopped their conversations and were turning to look at me with curious expressions. I expected to see aggression or alarm, but they seemed more interested than threatening. "Dr. Vasquez," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. What is this?" "This is our monthly company meeting," she said matter-of-factly. "Team building, project updates, new employee orientation, all the usual corporate activities. We just do them in a more authentic form during full moon periods." Authentic form? Without the constraints of human social expectations. When we can be our true selves without worrying about frightening people who wouldn't understand our nature. She gestured toward the group of werewolves, who were watching our conversation with obvious amusement. "Sam, meet the staff of Lunar Dynamics Corporation. We're a consulting firm that specializes in helping lycanthropes integrate their supernatural abilities into professional careers. Most of our employees are werewolves themselves, which makes it easier to understand our clients' unique challenges." I looked around the room, trying to process what she was telling me. "Everyone? All of your employees are werewolves?" "Yes, with a few exceptions. We have some human employees who work in client relations and regulatory compliance, positions that require interaction with purely human organizations. And the security guards? Frank? Pete?" Dr. Vasquez's smile became genuinely warm. "Also werewolves. Frank manages building security specifically because he can detect potential supernatural threats. Pete was promoted to day shift because his lycanthropic senses were too acute for night security work. He found the smells overwhelming during transformation periods. The pieces were starting to fall into place. So, I'm the only purely human employee in the building," Dr. Vasquez confirmed. "And that's exactly why we hired you." She gestured for me to step out of the elevator and join the group. Against all logic and self-preservation instinct, I found myself walking into a room full of werewolves. "You see, Sam, we've been conducting an experiment in supernatural human coexistence. The question we're trying to answer is whether lycanthropes can work alongside humans without the humans becoming aware of our true nature." "An experiment? Your job isn't really about building security," she continued. It's about testing whether a human with limited sensory capabilities can function normally in an environment populated entirely by werewolves. I thought about all the unusual policies, the modified office spaces, the restrictions on certain floors during specific times. You hired me because I can't smell what you really are. Exactly. Your chronic sinus condition made you the perfect test subject. You could work alongside lycanthropes for months without detecting the scent markers that would immediately alert a normal human to our supernatural nature. But I did start smelling things. Last week, during my rounds, Dr. Vasquez nodded. Environmental exposure to lycanthropic pheromones can sometimes trigger dormant sensory capabilities in humans. It's rare, but not unheard of, which brings us to an interesting decision point. She pulled out a tablet and showed me what looked like a detailed medical chart. We've been monitoring your health and behavior since you started working here. Blood tests from your employment, physical, behavioral observations from security camera footage, even analysis of skin cells you've shed in the building. That seems invasive. It's research, Sam, and the results are fascinating. Your exposure to our community has triggered some unusual changes in your physiology. Enhanced night vision, improved hearing, increased muscle mass, changes in dietary preferences. All subtle, but measurable. I thought about the past few months, realizing that she was right. I had been seeing better in low-light conditions, hearing conversations from further away, craving protein-rich foods more than usual. What are you saying? That I'm turning into a werewolf just from being around you? Not exactly. But you're developing some lycanthropic characteristics through prolonged exposure to our pheromones and biological energy fields. It's like a very mild, gradual infection. Not enough to trigger full transformations, but enough to enhance your natural capabilities. One of the other werewolves approached us. A woman I recognized as Janet Wu from Human Resources, though she was currently in partial wolf form. The question now, Janet said in a voice that was both professional and otherworldly, is what we do with this information. We could terminate your employment, relocate you to a different city, and use medical treatments to reverse the changes you've experienced. Or, I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer, or you could become a permanent part of our community, Dr. Vasquez said. Accept voluntary lycanthropic infection, complete the transformation process, and join Lunar Dynamics as a full supernatural employee. And if I choose option 1, you go back to your normal human life. We find a new test subject for our research, and you never speak about what you've learned here. She paused, studying my expression. Though I should mention that the physiological changes you've already experienced are irreversible. You'll never be quite fully human again, even if you choose not to embrace lycanthropy. I looked around the room at dozens of werewolves who were watching me with curious, hopeful expressions. For the first time in months, I felt like I was surrounded by people who understood aspects of existence that I was only beginning to discover. What kind of work would I be doing? If I chose option 2, security consulting for supernatural businesses, Frank said, approaching us in full werewolf form. There's a huge market for humans who can interface with normal society while understanding lycanthrope needs. You'd be traveling, helping other companies set up integration programs, developing policies for mixed supernatural human workplaces. Plus, Janet added, the benefits package is incredible. Full medical and dental, including specialized lycanthrope healthcare, 4 weeks paid vacation, flexible scheduling around moon cycles, and access to a social network that spans multiple cities. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a contract that was significantly more complex than my original employment agreement. This is a 5-year commitment with our organization, full lycanthropic transformation, specialized training, and guaranteed employment in our expanding consulting division. I read through the contract, which outlined salary, benefits, and job responsibilities that were far beyond anything I'd imagined when I applied for a simple security guard position. But it also outlined the transformation process, medical procedures, psychological counseling, and gradual exposure to controlled lycanthropic infections until I could achieve full werewolf form. "This is a lot to process," I said. "Of course it is," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Take your time. The offer will remain open for as long as you need to consider it. What happens to my life? My apartment, my few friends, my family? You relocate to housing that's designed for lycanthrope residents," Janet explained. "Similar to this building, but residential rather than commercial. You'll have a community of people who understand your nature, and you can maintain relationships with human friends and family as long as you're discreet about your abilities. It's not a prison sentence," Frank added. "It's just a different way of living. One that comes with capabilities and connections that most humans never get to experience." I spent the rest of that night talking with various employees of Lunar Dynamics Corporation, learning about their experiences with lycanthropy and how they'd integrated supernatural abilities into professional careers. Some of them had been born into werewolf families and had never known purely human existence. Others had been infected as adults and had to learn to balance their human identity with their supernatural nature. All of them described lycanthropy as challenging but ultimately rewarding. "The enhanced senses take some getting used to," one of the marketing managers told me, "but they make you incredibly good at reading people and situations. I can detect when clients are lying, when they're nervous about a deal, when they're genuinely excited about a project. The physical capabilities are amazing," added someone from the engineering department. "Increased strength, better reflexes, improved stamina. I can work longer hours and handle more complex projects than I ever could as a purely human employee. But the best part is the community," Janet said. "You're never alone in dealing with the challenges of lycanthropic life. There's always someone who understands what you're going through." By dawn, as the other employees began transforming back to their human forms and preparing to go home, I'd made my decision. "I'll do it," I told Dr. Vasquez. "But I want to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to." She smiled, the first completely genuine expression I'd seen from her. "Excellent. The transformation process takes about 3 months, with gradual exposure to lycanthropic biological agents followed by a controlled full infection. You'll retain your human consciousness and memories, but gain the ability to shift between human and werewolf forms at will. And the job? 6 months of specialized training, then deployment to cities where other companies are interested in developing supernatural integration programs. You'll be consulting with businesses that want to hire lycanthrope employees, helping them create workplace policies and physical environments that accommodate both human and supernatural workers." She handed me the signed contract and a packet of information about the transformation process. "Welcome to Lunar Dynamics Corporation, Sam. I think you're going to find that this career change opens doors you never knew existed." 6 months later, I was completing my first consulting assignment for a technology company in Portland that wanted to hire werewolves for their enhanced problem-solving abilities and natural teamwork instincts. The transformation process had been exactly as advertised: gradual, controlled, and ultimately successful. I could shift between human and werewolf forms at will, retained full consciousness in both states, and had developed sensory and physical capabilities that made me incredibly effective at my new job. But the greatest change wasn't physical. It was social. For the first time in my adult life, I was part of a community that understood and valued aspects of my nature that I'd never even realized existed. The night security job had been perfect, not because it was easy or well paid, but because it had led me to discover a hidden world of supernatural professionals who were creating new models for human lycanthrope coexistence. And sometimes, the best job you've ever had comes with requirements they don't mention in the interview, like the requirement to occasionally transform into a werewolf during company meetings, or the requirement to relocate to housing designed for people with supernatural abilities. with a requirement to keep certain aspects of your professional life secret from purely human friends and family. But it also comes with benefits they don't mention in the job posting. Enhanced capabilities that make you better at everything you do. A community of people who understand challenges that most humans can't even imagine, and opportunities to travel, learn, and contribute to projects that are literally changing the world. If you've ever taken a job that seemed too good to be true, ask yourself this. What did your employers really want from you? What were they hoping to discover about your capabilities, your limitations, your potential for growth? Because sometimes, the company that hires you isn't just looking for someone to fill a position. They're looking for someone to join a community, embrace a transformation, and become part of something larger than themselves. And if your coworkers seem unusually interested in your sense of smell, your tolerance for unusual sounds, or your comfort level with working during certain lunar phases, well, maybe it's time to start paying closer attention to what's really happening in your office building after dark. Some career opportunities come with transformations you never saw coming. The question is, are you ready to embrace them?